Please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky to Manchester.
Tell me this isn't working. It is? Yeah, I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories, but I'm the couple of days I've been in England, I've been developing some suspicions about the British Secret Service. I gave a talk in Oxford 2 days ago, some huge auditorium. The minute I started talking, all the power went out. It's one of the reasons I'm hoarse. I had to scream for an hour and a half. The minute I stopped talking, the power went on. And then when I heard this one go off, I figured this can't be a coincidence. So I expect this to go off any minute. We've just passed, as you know, the first anniversary of the President's declaration of victory in Iraq. I'm sure you saw the television pictures, the carefully staged extravaganza on the aircraft carrier properly placed in the harbor for the right views of the setting sun or whatever it was. I'm not going to speak about what's happening in Iraq on the ground. There's more than enough information about that coming. We can all draw our own conclusions. Instead, what I'd like to do is to comment on the new Imperial grand strategy that was supposed to be set in motion with the conquest of Iraq and where it stands today, actually much less successful than I had predicted, and what that implies about what's coming next. The phrase "New Imperial Grand Strategy," I should make clear, is not mine, nor incidentally is the phrase "the world's second superpower." The phrase "the world's second superpower" comes from a very unhappy New York Times article reporting the mid-February 2003 demonstrations around the world and saying, well, it seems there are now two superpowers in the United States and world public opinion. I'm not particularly happy about that, but it's an accurate description. The phrase "New Imperial Grand Strategy" comes from the main establishment foreign policy journal in the United States, the Journal of Foreign Affairs of the Council on Foreign Relations. It appeared in an article that was published immediately within weeks after the release of the Bush administration National Security Strategy. It was September 2002, which was accompanied by a virtual announcement of the plan to invade Iraq. The UN was informed right away that it could be relevant, it's the word that the government used, they could be relevant by agreeing to authorize what the United States was going to do anyway, with Britain loyally following behind, in what's called a partnership, I think. I must say, when I got to England a couple of days ago, I saw a speech by Tony Blair reported in which he said he was going to stand shoulder to shoulder with George Bush. And the unkind phrase that immediately came to mind was shoulder to knee with George Bush, but it's too impolite to say, so I withdraw it. It announced the intention. The UN was told it could be relevant by authorizing it. Otherwise, it could go on, but it could be, as Colin Powell explained to them, they could be a debating society. Those are the choices for the world. The National Security Strategy itself was a very clear, forthright declaration of the intention to dominate the world indefinitely, by force if necessary, the one dimension in which the United States still reigns supreme, overwhelmingly so, and to destroy any perceived potential challenge to this dominance. And the invasion of Iraq was to be the illustration of the doctrine. Well, the doctrine itself, quite apart from the plans to invade, led to unprecedented protest around the world, including, interestingly, the foreign policy elite within the United States, pretty much across the board. Again, unprecedented. So in the journal Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, the new Imperial grand strategy, as it was called, was immediately criticized within weeks as a threat, as dangerous, a threat to the United States and to the world. And the elite criticism was remarkably broad, but it was also quite narrow. It's not that the principle was wrong. There's very little criticism of the principle, but rather of the style of its presentation and the manner of its implementation. The basic thrust of the criticism was captured rather well by Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, also in the journal Foreign Affairs, in one of a series of articles about this. She pointed out that every president has a similar doctrine, but the president keeps it in his back pocket, kind of quiet about it, pulls it out to use when necessary, and that it's a serious error to sort of smash people in the face with it and to implement it in brazen defiance, even of allies, and to make it clear to them you have total contempt for them, let alone the rest of the world. That's foolish and dangerous. And that was the basic character of the criticism, very broad, but also very thin. Albright herself, of course, knew that Clinton had a similar doctrine. She had been UN ambassador under Clinton, and in that capacity, she had informed the United Nations that the United States will act multilaterally when it can and unilaterally when it must. And when she went on to become Secretary of State, she was, of course, aware of the regular White House messages to Congress, where the meaning of that was spelled out. Clinton declared the right to use force to ensure access to markets and resources, even without the pretexts that Bush and Blair conjured up. Taken literally, the Clinton doctrine goes far beyond the national security strategy, use force to ensure access to markets and resources. But it was issued quietly. Messages to Congress. If Parliament is anything like Congress, nobody was listening or probably reading comic books or something. But it was quiet, it wasn't reported, and it wasn't issued in a way to be offensive. And the implementation was similar. It was implemented, but in ways that allowed allies and others to feel that somehow their worth was higher than zero. And as Albright correctly pointed out in the same article, this doctrine goes far back, has a long tradition. She didn't give the details, but in the United States, you can find the same doctrine in virtually the same words as the Bush strategy back as early as 1941, before the United States entered the war. The war was going on, but the U.S. wasn't in it yet. And the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations were running extensive sessions on how to run the post-war world. It was clear at that time that the United States would emerge as the world dominant power. Britain would be what the Foreign Office here later called a junior partner to the United States, and nobody would come close to the U.S. in wealth or power, and therefore it would be their task to organize the world, and in the plans to do so, I won't bother quoting it, but the wording is approximately the same as the national security strategy. But again, that was quiet. It was public, but it was never reported. You can't find it in scholarship. It's only known by people who have to know it. And it wasn't, it wasn't done with brazen arrogance. And of course, there are plenty of other precedents outside the United States. Britain has a miserable, ugly, and vicious record, which I don't have to tell you about, and the continental powers are no different, the same elsewhere. Nevertheless, despite the rich precedent, the new imperial grand strategy was understood to be highly significant. Henry Kissinger wrote about it. He called it a revolutionary new doctrine. And as he observed, it tears to shreds, publicly and openly, the 17th century system of international order, the so-called Westphalian system. Of course, it also throws into the ash can the UN Charter and international law. I think Kissinger apparently considered that too insignificant to mention, but it does. Kissinger felt that this revolutionary new doctrine was the correct one, but he also criticized, cautioned really about the style and the implementation. And he added a very crucial qualification, which is usually tacit. He said the doctrine is fine, but it cannot be universalized. That is, it's the United States alone that has the right of aggression at will. The U.S. may delegate it to clients, but the doctrine can't be a universal doctrine. So in other words, we must forcefully reject the most elementary of moral truisms, namely that we apply to ourselves the same standards that we apply to others. And Kissinger should be congratulated, in my opinion, for his honesty in correctly articulating doctrines that are prevailing but are usually concealed in rhetoric about virtuous intent and tortured legalisms and so on. He just said it straight out. Moral standards are not for us. We use force, nobody else does, and that cannot be universalized. That's good, that's clear. There was also some, not much, but some critical commentary on the new doctrine on quite different grounds. One, from an interesting source, was an article by Arthur Schlesinger, perhaps the most respected living American historian, Kennedy advisor and memoirist. As the bombs began to fall on Baghdad a year ago, Schlesinger wrote an article in which he recalled the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on what Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. And Schlesinger said Roosevelt was correct, and now it is Americans who live in infamy as the government adopts the policies of Imperial Japan. That was a unique, honest, near unique, honest criticism in the mainstream. He also added that the Bush administration had succeeded in converting a global wave of sympathy for the United States to a global wave of hatred for American arrogance and militancy. That was a year ago. Polls more recently show that it's far more extreme, and as you know from other very intensive polls in Iraq taken by British and American polling institutions, and the United States and Britain have succeeded in doing the same thing in Iraq. They've converted an initial wave of at least tolerance, if not sympathy, to intense hatred. I mean, they have even succeeded, according to the most recent published poll, in turning Muqtada al-Sadr into the second most admired figure in Iraq, second only to the Grand Ayatollah. And by now, polls show about, among Iraqi Arabs, 12 to 1. By 12 to 1, they regard the U.S. and Britain as an occupying force, not a liberating force. If you add Kurds who have their own aspirations, it gets down, according to the latest polls, to 9 to 1, which is unprecedented. I mean, the Germans didn't have that much opposition in occupied Europe. And that is an achievement. To have achieved that is a sign of some talent. It was also anticipated that the war would increase the threat of terror. That was predicted by most specialists and intelligence agencies, and that's happened as well. There are Middle East specialists who monitor attitudes in the Muslim world, and they express themselves to be astonished, I'm quoting, by the revival of the appeal of global jihadi Islam that had been in decline. Recruitment for al-Qaeda networks increased. Iraq, which had had no ties to terror before, became what Harvard's leading specialist on terrorism calls a terrorist haven. Iraq suffered its first suicide attacks since the 13th century. The suicide bombings last year, the year 2003, reached their highest level in modern times. And the year ended in the United States with a terrorism alert of unprecedented severity. On the anniversary of the invasion, the Grand Central Station in New York, the major rail station, was patrolled by heavily armed police with flak jackets and submachine guns. This was, of course, a reaction to the bombing in Madrid shortly before, the worst terrorist crime in Europe. A few days after the Madrid bombing, Spain voted out the government that had gone to war against the will of the overwhelming majority of the population, and had indeed been highly praised by U.S. and other Western intellectuals for showing its democratic credentials by following orders from Crawford, Texas, instead of and dismissing maybe 90% of the population. It was quite general at the time. But they voted out the government a few days after the Madrid bombing. Spain was no longer praised. It was then bitterly condemned for appeasing terrorists by voting the government out. Actually, what the Spanish voters voted for was withdrawal of troops unless they were under UN authorization. The commentators who condemned the Spanish voters for their weakness and cowardice failed to point out that this is essentially the position of about 70% of Americans, and it has been pretty much for about a year. The large majority, now 70%, holds that the United Nations should take the lead in Iraq in civil order control, security issues, economic reconstruction, working with Iraqis to establish some democratic government. There are differences between the United States and Spain, some crucial ones. In Spain, people know what public opinion is. In the United States, only those who do research projects know what public opinion is. You can find it out. There are intensive studies of public opinion. The other difference is that in Spain, people can vote on this issue. In the United States right now, it's just inconceivable. This could not enter the electoral agenda. You can draw your own conclusions from that. Ask yourself questions about England. There is a curious performance underway right now I think it would intrigue some independent Martian observer. It's going on in Washington and in Western commentary in general. There's a very lively debate about whether the Bush administration downgraded the so-called war on terror in favor of its ambitions in Iraq. This was based on revelations by recent Bush administration officials, which I'm sure you've seen. The only thing that was surprising about those revelations is that anybody finds them surprising, particularly right now, when it is so clear that by invading Iraq, they did exactly that. That is, they consciously increased the threat of terror in order to achieve their goals in Iraq. And in the face of this dramatic demonstration, what is there to discuss? Well, apparently a lot. Even without this dramatic demonstration of their priorities, the point should have been obvious. From the point of view of administration, and it's pretty rational, from the point of view of administration planners, just think it through. Terror might kill thousands of Americans, but that's been obvious since 1993. 1993, Islamic jihadists organized by the United States and their British associates and others practically blew up the World Trade Center. They failed, but only because of bad planning. If it planned a little better, they would have killed tens of thousands of people. It was certainly obvious then what could happen. And in fact, the risk assessment for terrorism did not change on September 11th. It's the same when an effort happens to fail and when an effort happens to succeed, same risk. And if you look at the technical publications through the 90s, this is pointed out regularly. So yes, they know that a terrorist attack could kill thousands of Americans, but that's just not very important in comparison with the establishing the first secure military bases in a dependent client state, which is itself a huge oil, has huge resources, and right in the center of the world's major energy reserves. I mean, that is really important. Back in the 1940s, same time that post-war planning was going on, the State Department pointed out that the resources of the Gulf region are what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. So of course, one of the highest priorities was to make sure you take control of them. Notice the United States did not use the oil. The U.S. itself was, North America is the major producer until about 1970. But the point is not using the resources, it's controlling them. And that was understood. George Kennan, one of the leading planners, way out at the humane dovish side, pointed out that we have to do this, we have to take control of the resources, because it gives us veto power over what others might do, primarily our allies. They have to be kept under control, and controlling the resources gives veto power. That's now understood as well, of course. So it's just perfectly natural that Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, other planners were regarded control over this, attaining this tremendous, expanding this tremendous lever of world control as far more significant than terror. And it's not, you shouldn't be in the least surprised that they and their British counterparts were pressing the intelligence communities to provide some shred of evidence, however thin, to justify the invasion. Weapons of mass destruction, ties to terror, anything would do. And there are plenty of other indications that those are the priorities, quite dramatic ones right now. So just take, say, last week. Last week, George Bush imposed sanctions on Syria. That was in accord with an act passed by Congress last December, the Syria Accountability Act, which is a virtual declaration of war against Syria. And this was the implementation of it. Well, what's the effect of that war, of the sanctions? The main effect is to deprive the United States of an extremely valuable source of information on al-Qaeda-style terrorism, which Syria doesn't like one bit. And they've been cooperating and providing information on these groups to U.S. intelligence. Syria is, and this now cuts it off. So what's more important? What's so important that you have to cut off a major source of information about terrorism? Well, that's pretty clear. Syria is refusing to accept U.S. orders on how to organize the Middle East. And making sure you get obedience is far more important than the war on terror. So we have another dramatic demonstration of the priorities. Actually, Syria technically is on what's called the list. There is a list of states that support terror, and Syria is on the list. The CIA acknowledges that Syria hasn't been involved in any suspected support for terror for at least 15 years. And we can tell just how serious this concern is by Clinton's offer to Syria to take them off the list of states supporting terror if they would agree to U.S.-Israeli proposals for how to resolve the Golan Heights issue. When Syria insisted on regaining its territory, the territory that had been conquered. They were kept on the state list supporting terror. It tells anybody who wants to know just what that list is. If you want to know more about it, look back a little. In the roughly 25 years since the list of states supporting terror has been functioning, one state has been removed from it, namely Iraq, under Saddam Hussein. Iraq was removed under the Reagan administration from states supporting terror so as to allow the United States and Britain and others freely to provide Saddam with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction with badly aided need and so on, right through the period of his worst atrocities, through the worst of them. And this continued, in fact, through the smashing of the Shiite rebellion in 1991 that might have overthrown him. I mean, now these events are brought up as proof that we somehow have to invade, and happily forgetting the fact that we supported it all along, right through that. And so Iraq was taken off the list of states supporting terror in the 80s. There was a gap in the list at that point, so you had to add somebody. And the state that was added was Cuba, perhaps in recognition of the fact that the terrorist war against Cuba that the United States has been waging quite intensively since the Kennedy administration had in fact peaked to new heights of savagery in the late 1970s. So it made sense for Cuba to be added to the list of states supporting terror. All of this passes without comment in educated commentary in the West. Cuba gives you another indication of the priorities of the war on terror. The Treasury Department in the United States has an office called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC it's called, and it has a task. Its task is to monitor suspicious transfers of currencies internationally. Well, that's a core part of the war on terror, obviously. And OFAC does have people working on that. Four officials are working on monitoring the finances of Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. That compares to 21 who are monitoring efforts to evade the illegal U.S. embargo on Cuba, declared illegal in every international forum. So 5 times as many people are monitoring attempts to evade the U.S. embargo on Cuba as are involved in Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda's financing. Again, tells you something about priorities. It's far more important to strangle Cuba than to fight the war on terror, just as it's far more important to invade Iraq. And we know the reasons for that, too. The United States is a very free and open society, actually the most free and open in the world, so we have huge amounts of information about government planning. Fortunately, there's a quite obedient intellectual class, so it doesn't get very far, but it's there if you want to find it. And the reasons for the war, the terrorist war against Cuba and the economic strangulation are explained very frankly, right during the Kennedy years when it began a little earlier, but really took off under Kennedy. It's explained by intelligence and State Department planners that I'm quoting it, the very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies that go back to the 1820s, that is, to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine announced the U.S. intention to control the Western Hemisphere and to keep everybody else out. The U.S. couldn't do it at that time because it had a major enemy which was too powerful, namely England. England was a deterrent. It prevented the United States from invading Canada, which it tried to do several times, and from conquering Cuba and so on. But they realized that over time the balance of forces would shift, and sooner or later the U.S. would be powerful enough and England would be weak enough so that you could implement the Monroe Doctrine, and precisely what happened. Cuba's successful defiance is violating U.S. principles that go back to the 1820s, nothing to do about Russia. Arthur Schlesinger, who was at that time the head of Kennedy's Latin American mission, provided Kennedy with a report of the mission, which said there are other reasons, more deeper reasons. It said that The danger that Cuba poses is what he called the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands. It's an idea which might influence other people in Latin America who are suffering the same kinds of oppression and violence and so on. And if that idea spreads, you're really in trouble. That's more than just successful defiance in one place. And in fact, if you look over post-war history, post-Second World War history, that's the leading motive for intervention and violence and subversion, almost always. Something else is conjured up, but that's typically the leading motive. In any event, punishing successful defiance is far more important than fighting the war on terror. Any mafia don would understand at once, you can't accept successful defiance. That's dangerous. And you've got to make sure it's destroyed, and that's far more important than the war on terror. Well, there's case after case like this, but no matter how many examples there are and how rational the policies are, they cannot be perceived. They can't be discussed, they can't be perceived. This is a small sample. The farce that's going on in Washington now and the concern about it is just another illustration of the incapacity to perceive the obvious. It's kind of intriguing that as one pretext after another disappears and the leadership, British and American leadership, announce some new one, commentary follows along, always conspicuously evading the obvious reasons, which is virtually unmentionable among Western intellectuals, at least, educated classes. Actually, not everywhere. Like in Baghdad, they perceive it. One of the U.S. polls in Baghdad last October asked Baghdadis to formulate in their own words the reasons why the United States invaded. The overwhelming majority took it for granted that the reason for the invasion was to take control of Iraq's resources and to reorganize the Middle East in U.S. interests. I'll come back to more about that poll in a minute. But they can somehow see what we can't allow ourselves to see. And that's not so unusual either. The people at the wrong end of the club quite often have a much clearer perception of understanding of the world. It's true in human relations quite generally. There happens to be a very broad consensus among specialists as to how to reduce the threat of terror, if anybody's interested. I should mention here that I'm following a deplorable convention, so I apologize, but I'll keep to it. The convention is that the term terror is restricted to the subcategory of terror that they carry out against us. Excluded is the usually far greater terror that we carry out against them. That's not terror. That's self-defense or noble, generous impulses or some other term. So I'll keep to that, but with this reservation. So just keeping to that terror, there's a clear consensus on how to reduce it, and there's also very strong, clear consensus on how to incite further terrorist atrocities. And sooner or later, these are going to become truly horrendous. It's just a matter of time before terror and weapons of mass destruction are linked, and the consequences could be awful. But that's not considered important enough to act to reduce the threat of terror, though it's understood. It was understood long before September 11th, I should say. The Iraq invasion is quite typical. It did increase the threat of terror, as expected, and that's common. Violence quite commonly elicits greater violence in response. There are some very good detailed investigations of Al-Qaeda, best ones by a British analyst, Jason Burke. I'll sort of follow his analysis, but it's standard. Al-Qaeda, incidentally, as he points out, is not an organization. There's no such thing. It's kind of a loose network of often not even affiliated organizations which have more or less similar doctrines and have maybe some connections and so on. So it's kind of a loose array of networks. We'll call it Al-Qaeda. He points out that Al-Qaeda was essentially unknown. In fact, if you look at U.S. intelligence records, not even mentioned, And bin Laden was considered a very insignificant figure until 1998, when Clinton bombed Afghanistan and the Sudan. Now, that led immediately to a sharp increase in support, recruitment, financing for al-Qaeda-style networks. It turned bin Laden into a major figure, which he had not been before. And it also forged close relations between bin Laden and the Taliban. The relations before had been cool or hostile. Just on the side, we learn something more about ourselves, always the most important topic, by looking at the reaction in the West to those bombings. So take, say, the Sudan. In the Sudan, Clinton bombed what he and intelligence knew was the major source of pharmaceutical supplies in the Sudan and veterinary medicines. If terrorists blew up, say, half the pharmaceutical supplies in some country that matters, like, say, England or the United States or Israel, we'd know about it and care about it. And of course, the effects are much worse in a poor country like Sudan. The few credible estimates that exist are that this led to the death of tens of thousands of people. But this does not enter the annals of terrorism for the reasons I mentioned. It's not something they did to us. And there's very little interest. In fact, interest is non-existent, and no one bothers to investigate, apart from a few who reach that conclusion. Well, that's not at all unusual. In fact, it's quite typical. Again, those at the wrong end of the clubs, they tend to view these things rather differently. Well, going back to how to incite terror, after Clinton's bombing in 1998, the next major contribution to the growth of al-Qaeda and the prominence of bin Laden was the bombing of Afghanistan. This was without any credible pretext. That was conceded months later, quietly. That led to a sharp increase in recruitment and enthusiasm for what was by then being called the cosmic struggle between good and evil. And that's the rhetoric which is shared by bin Laden and George Bush's speechwriters. I'm assuming that bin Laden writes his own orations. Reviewing many examples of this kind, Burke concludes that every use of force is, as he puts it, another small victory for bin Laden. And that kind of conclusion is quite widely shared. Among others, it's shared by Israeli heads of Israeli military intelligence and the general security services, adapted to their own context, but essentially the same point. There are new illustrations of this principle almost daily. So take the worst atrocity so far in single atrocity in Iraq, the Marine invasion of Fallujah, which killed hundreds, maybe more people. We don't know because we don't care. We don't investigate our own crimes, typically. The invasion of Fallujah was the response to the killing of 4 American security contractors in Fallujah. Responsibility for those killings was taken by a new organization which called itself Brigades of Martyr Ahmed Yassin. They were avenging the murder a few days earlier of the quadriplegic cleric, Sheikh Yassin, and about half a dozen bystanders as he left a mosque in Gaza. This is described in the West as an Israeli assassination. That's not accurate. He was killed by a U.S. helicopter flown by an Israeli pilot. Israel doesn't make helicopters. The helicopters are sent to Israel by the United States with the knowledge that that's the way they're going to be used. They're not used in self-defense. They're used for things like targeted assassinations and other atrocities. So it's a U.S.-Israeli assassination. Just in the several months before that, the 5 months before the killing of Sheikh Yassin, so-called targeted assassinations, mostly by helicopters and missiles, had killed about 50 suspects and approximately 80 or 90 bystanders. Well, in the Fallujah case, you trace the chain of violence, the straight line from the U.S.-Israeli assassination of Sheikh Yassin up to the conflagration in Iraq, which practically went out of control. And that was known right away, but virtually silenced in the media, in the United States at least. In the United States, there's a healthy skepticism about the media, so it's carefully studied, but not so in other countries. You can check here. There's also a broad consensus among the same specialists on how to reduce the threat of terror, and it's perfectly reasonable. Terrorists regard themselves as a vanguard. They're trying to mobilize a constituency, and therefore an effort to reduce terror will be two-pronged. It will be concerned with the terrorists and with their constituency. With regard to the terrorists themselves, they're carrying out criminal acts, and criminal acts you respond to with police work. And it's been quite successful. In Europe, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, there's been very successful dismantling of many of the terrorist networks just through police work. It would be even more if financing was monitored instead of more important things like strangling Cuba, for example. That does succeed and has succeeded. Then comes the constituency, which is far more important. Here we have a choice. We can help the terrorist vanguard mobilize the constituency by violence, which of course they're happy to have as a contribution to proving that they're doing the right thing, or we can address the reasons why the constituency is there. The constituency may be people who hate the terrorists and fear them, but nevertheless perceive that somehow their cause is right and just because they're struggling against real grievances. That's exactly what happened with Muqtada al-Sadr, according to the Western polls. His respect shot up because he was the only person standing up to the American occupation. Well, okay, that's the way you can mobilize a constituency. And you can mobilize support for al-Qaeda by violence, as the examples I mentioned showed, or you can pay some attention to the grievances. And when you do, you find that many of them are quite legitimate, and you ought to deal with them quite apart from any relation with terror. But if you do that, then that reduces the threat of terror. And there's plenty of examples of that too. Britain and Northern Ireland is a perfectly good example, right next door. As long as England reacted to IRA terrorism with violence, it was a gift to the most militant elements in the IRA. It led to more terror and more support. As soon as England began finally paying some attention to the grievances, which were quite legitimate, things moved in another direction. Northern Ireland's a far more peaceful place than it was 10 years ago. And there are many examples of that. And it's well understood. The reason that path isn't taken is because the great powers don't want to attend to the grievances. It's another matter of priority. Having terror is less important than having to deal with the grievances and giving up some privilege and power. But there are many examples. Now, it's not that violence can't succeed. It can. And we have plenty of examples of that too. The fate of the indigenous population of the United States is a very clear example of how violence can succeed. From the moment that crazed religious fanatics from England landed in what is now the United States and began slaughtering the Amalekites and that sort of thing. From then on, as this spread through the continent, they just exterminated millions of people. And it succeeded. It's kind of interesting to see how that success is treated as well. There's no time for that. So yes, violence can succeed, but often at a tremendous cost, or violence can elicit more violence. Plenty of examples of that too. Examples I just gave, including the invasion of Iraq, are some, but they're much more important ones right now, current ones. So take this one is vastly more important. 2 months ago, Russia carried out its largest military exercises in 2 decades. They displayed new, more sophisticated weapons of mass destruction targeting the United States and Europe. And the Russian leaders made it clear that this was a direct response to Bush administration aggressiveness and militancy, to borrow Schlesinger's term, exactly as had been predicted, incidentally. It was predicted right away that this was going to lead to a Russian response, and it has. One prime concern that the Russian generals expressed was Washington's current development of what are called low-yield nuclear weapons, popularly called bunker busters. The Russians can figure out just as well as U.S. strategic analysts do that these weapons are designed to destroy Russian command centers, which are hidden inside mountains, just like the American ones, and could theoretically be destroyed by deep penetration, low-yield bunker busters. That would destroy their nuclear arsenal. Washington's insistence on using space for military purposes, this again unilateral, this includes devastating first strike, is another major concern of Russian planners. And they were acting as you'd expect, and as was predicted, by building up their offensive military capacity. U.S. analysts suspect that the Russians are now duplicating the U.S. development of hypersonic cruise vehicles. These can orbit space. They can orbit in space at a low altitude right outside the Earth's atmosphere, and they can instantly penetrate the Earth's atmosphere, delivering a devastating attack anywhere without any warning. And the Russians are probably duplicating it. U.S. analysts also estimate that Russian military expenditures have approximately tripled in the Bush-Putin years. So in fact, there may be some truth to what Bush described as his gut reaction when he met Putin for the first time, and he looked into his eyes and he saw that they were soulmates. Perhaps they are. The Russians have also formally adopted Bush's doctrine of so-called preemptive strike, meaning aggression at will. That's the revolutionary new doctrine of the national security strategy. They're also relying on automated response systems. In the past, we know that these have come literally within minutes of launching a nuclear strike, barely aborted by human intervention. By now, the systems have deteriorated with the collapse of the Russian economy under the market fanaticism of the last 10 years. Well, we know a lot about the U.S. systems. The U.S. automated systems allow 3 minutes for human judgment after computers warn of a missile attack. And that's a daily occurrence. So every day there's a 3-minute period in which you discuss whether to allow the world to be blown up or not. After that, you'll be happy to know comes a 30-second presidential press briefing after the 3 minutes. The Pentagon has also found very serious design flaws in the computer systems, computer security systems. This will surprise absolutely no one who has any acquaintance with complicated software and computers. In fact, for that matter, anybody who has a computer. So it's known that there are going to be design flaws, and they've found them. But this is a lot worse than your hard disk crashing. They have also discovered that errors in the computer security systems could allow terrorist hackers to break in and simulate a launch. That's called an accident waiting to happen by U.S. strategic analysts. And the Russian systems are far less reliable. Well, the dangers are very severe, and they're being consciously escalated by the threat and use of violence. And here we're talking about real threats to survival of the species. This is not thousands of people being killed, but they're being consciously escalated because of the priorities, which are rational in their own terms. Right now, the U.S. is deploying what's called a missile defense system, in Alaska. It's coming under criticism. The criticism is that it's obviously a political gesture timed for the election, and that it's using untested technology, which probably won't work, at an immense cost. All of that may be correct, but there's a much more fundamental criticism. The fundamental criticism is that it might work, or it might look as though it's going to work, and opponents have to make a worst-case analysis. So if it looks as if it might work, they're going to have to take countermeasures, and the countermeasures will be massively building up means to overwhelm it. You have to understand that the Chinese and the Russians understand just as well as U.S. analysts, who are open about it, that missile defense is a first strike weapon. It's what they call a sword, not a shield. It expands the domain of freedom of aggression, including first strike. And that's the way the U.S. has reacted in the past. They recently declassified records about the U.S. reaction to Russia's deployment of a very small, limited ABM system around Moscow in 1968. And as you'd predict, the U.S. responded to that by targeting it with nuclear weapons, targeting the outlying radar sites with nuclear weapons. This is a much more serious system, and the reaction will be even more extreme, especially for the Chinese. China has a very limited deterrent, a couple dozen missiles, and this would, if it even looks like it's going to work, will eliminate the credibility of that, so they're going to have to massively expand it. Well, if China expands its offensive military capacity, India is going to react to that, and Pakistan will respond to India's doing it, and you get a ripple effect that goes on, vastly increasing the threat to all of us. That particular part is discussed and is indeed dangerous. What is not discussed, however, is the threat from West Asia. Now, it is discussed internally. So the U.S. Strategic Command, the top planning agency for nuclear weapons, its former head, General Lee Butler, describes Israel's weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. He describes it as dangerous in the extreme, both because of the threat that it poses and because it incites proliferation in response. Actually, the Bush administration is now enhancing that threat. Israel already has, its Air Force is larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power other than the U.S., according to its own estimate. It's not because Israel's so powerful, it's because it's an offshore U.S. military base in effect. So their Air Force is already more powerful than, say, Britain's or any other NATO power. And the United States is now sending them over 100 of the most advanced jet bombers, F-16Is, with the announcement that they can, they're capable of flying to Iran and back. They also announced that these are updated versions of the F-16s that Israel used to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the Osirak reactor, in 1981. There's a kind of a story about that the Israeli bombing deterred Saddam's nuclear weapons program. It was known right away that that's not true. The Osirak reactor was inspected by the head of Harvard's physics department immediately. He's a nuclear power specialist. And he reported in Nature, the world's main science journal, that it's just not designed for nuclear weapons. However, we now know from defectors and other evidence that it did initiate Iraq's nuclear weapons program, another indication of the standard cycle of violence inducing violence. The Israeli press, in their Hebrew versions, they don't translate this into English, adds that the United States is now providing the Israeli Air Force with what they call special weapons. Okay, we can guess what they are. But you can figure out what Iranian intelligence assumes. This is all aimed at Iranian intelligence, who, of course, read this material. They're going to have to make a worst-case analysis. You can figure it out. I don't know about it telling you. Perhaps the purpose is to incite some Iranian action that will be a pretext for an attack. Perhaps it's just to rattle the leadership and to contribute to internal conflict or chaos, but whatever it is, it's obviously seriously increasing threats which at this level are become threats to survival. Well, the collapse of the pretexts for invading Iraq are quite familiar, but not enough attention has been paid, I think, to the most important consequence of the collapse of the pretexts of Blair and Bush and others. The original pretext was that the U.S. has the right to attack a country if it has links to terror and is developing weapons of mass destruction. Okay, can't say that anymore. And there's a new doctrine that has been proposed which expands the right of aggression. The links to terror have been dropped, and it is now no longer necessary for a country to have weapons of mass destruction or even programs for developing, but to have, I'm quoting the official story from Colin Powell and others, it's enough that the country have the intent and ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. Okay, who has the ability? Any country that has a high school chemistry and biology lab has the ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. Who has the intent? Well, whatever Tony Blair and Jack Straw and their American associates say. To translate that into simple language, it means anybody is subject to attack, instant, devastating, unwarned attack at any moment if they just disobey orders. That's the new doctrine, far more expansive than the old one. And new military programs are being developed to enhance the capacity to carry this out. Actually, an extremely important one was announced immediately after the National Security Strategy was released, in September 2002. Plans were announced right away with regard to militarization of space to shift from the Clinton doctrine. The Clinton doctrine was that the U.S. must control space, to shift from that to a new doctrine, from control of space to what's called ownership of space. Ownership of space means instant engagement anywhere in the world from space, putting any part of the world at risk of instant destruction thanks to sophisticated surveillance systems and lethal weaponry that's going to be placed in space we are now going to own. Well, that's quite in accord with the national security strategy. Control isn't enough. You have to go on to ownership. Well, the world's intelligence agencies can read the Air Force Space Command Strategic Master Plan, from which I've just been quoting as easily as I can, or more easily, and they'll draw the natural conclusions. You can figure out what they will be. That increases the risk to all of us, a very severe risk. The collapse of the pretexts did lead to a new doctrine. Actually, it's not called a doctrine, it's called a vision. Actually, it's called a messianic vision by the elite U.S. press. Turns out that the war in Iraq was inspired by the president's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq and to the whole region. And the president affirmed the vision in a presidential address last November. Well, it was interesting to see the reaction. I read as much as I could about it in England too, but mostly the U.S. The reaction ranged from, at one end, just rapturous awe. The leading veteran correspondent of the Washington Post, the former editor of the International Herald Tribune, concluded breathlessly that shows that the Iraq invasion was the noblest war in history because it was inspired by a messianic vision. There were those who criticized the doctrine, the vision, namely that it's beyond our means. It's generous and noble, but beyond our means. The beneficiaries aren't worth it. They're too backward. Others may not share our nobility and altruism and such problems. That this is the motive for the invasion is presupposed, isn't even discussed. It's just presupposed in news reporting and commentary, and then you're either critical or in awe. A few as a research project, you might look for the evidence that this is the reason. It turns out that the evidence reduces to one fact. Our leader announced it. Therefore, it is true, period. North Korea couldn't do better. Just check that out and see if it's true. Also, to accept that this is the motive requires suppressing your knowledge that if that's the motive, Bush and Blair must be among the most astounding liars in history, because when they mobilized the world for war, tried to, there was a single question. Is Iraq going to live up to getting rid of its weapons of mass destruction? All right, it turns out they're now saying that was a total lie. The real reason was our messianic vision, and we're supposed to accept that as gospel truth and sort of forget the fact that the people who are telling it to us are also telling us they're among the most extreme liars ever. But properly educated intellectual class is quite capable of this. You can check for yourself. I've yet to find, I have not found an exception with considerable search, except way out on the margins. Actually, there is one exception, one glaring exception. A few days after the president revealed his vision, the Washington Post published the results of a US-run poll in Baghdad, the one I mentioned before. People were asked why they thought the US invaded Iraq, and there were some who agreed with roughly 100% of articulate Western opinion, namely that the goal is to bring democracy to Iraq. In Baghdad, 1% agreed with that. 5% thought that the goal was to help Iraqis. This is last October, not way before all of the latest revelations. And the rest said the obvious, what I already mentioned, the view that's the idea that's inexpressible in the West. Well, Iraqis don't have to know American history to understand what the noble vision means. We can look at that history and find it out, but they don't have to. They know their own history. That's enough. So, for example, they know that England created Iraq, modern Iraq, drew its borders, and created it so that England, not Turkey, would get control of the oil in the northern area, and also that Iraq would have to be independent because it would have no access to the sea. That's why the Principality of Kuwait was carved out. So that's the way it was created. They know that England also had noble visions, messianic visions. Iraq was independent, had a constitution, parliament, all sorts of nice things. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Office and Lord Curzon were carrying out their own plans, which were released 60 years later. England's much slower than the United States, but they're there. And it turns out that they were doing what you'd expect. Their plan was that Iraq and other countries of the region should be what they called an Arab facade, that Britain would rule behind various constitutional fictions. Actually, that conception was just reported 2 or 3 days ago by a senior British official who said that after the turnover of sovereignty to Iraq on June 30th, Iraq will have full sovereignty, but in practice, it won't exercise it fully. That's familiar. Arab facade that we rule behind various constitutional fictions. And Iraqis didn't need the British Foreign Office records to know this. They know it from their own experience, like the people at the wrong end of the clubs, typically. And furthermore, they can see what is now happening right in front of their eyes. So the United States is building the world's biggest embassy in Baghdad, sensitively using one of Saddam's main palaces to house it. The head of the embassy, the new ambassador, is John Negroponte. When he was appointed, the Wall Street Journal had a good article about him in which it said, he called him a modern proconsul. And he said that Wolfowitz learned his trade as a proconsul during the Reaganite phase of the current administration in Washington, when he was ambassador to Honduras, presiding over the second largest embassy in Latin America and the biggest CIA station in the world. not because Honduras is such a center of world power, but because his responsibility as proconsul, which is what he was called in Honduras, his responsibility was to supervise the military bases from which the U.S. mercenary army was carrying out a destructive, murderous terrorist war against Nicaragua to stop another effort at successful defiance. Practically destroyed the country, but it's regarded as a grand success because now no more successful defiance. That was his job in Honduras. So he learned his trade as a proconsul. That led to the United States being brought to the World Court, condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, ordered to terminate the crime, after which the current incumbents in Washington, including the moderate Colin Powell, escalated the crime. They were ordered to pay reparations, huge reparations. You know what happened to that. When the U.S. refused, Nicaragua took it to the Security Council. There were 2 resolutions in which the Security Council restated and supported the World Court judgment and called on all states to observe international law. They were vetoed by the United States, with Britain politely abstaining, and they're out of history because they say the wrong thing, like terror against other people. Well, that's Negroponte's history, and he's perfectly qualified to run the world's biggest embassy in the world in Iraq in order to transfer sovereignty to Iraqis, we're told. Okay, you can decide whether you want to believe that. Iraqis can also see, as we all can if we want, that the U.S. is insisting on keeping military bases and military forces essentially permanently, and as Paul Wolfowitz puts it, only a stable, prolonged U.S. troop presence and a weak Iraqi army will allow us to nurture democracy in Iraq. Okay, you can decide what you think about that. Wolfowitz, incidentally, is called the idealist in chief of the Bush administration, the visionary leading the crusade for democracy. If there were time, there isn't, I'd run through his record, which is intriguing. You rarely find anyone with a record of such visceral hatred of democracy and support for tyranny shown in case after case, but we'll put that aside. It doesn't matter for the Messianic vision that Iraqis overwhelmingly want Iraqis to be in charge of security. Not all, again. So 7% of Iraqis want U.S. forces to be in charge. 5% want the U.S.-appointed governing council to be in charge. These are British-run polls last October again. Now, of course, it's much worse. But it just doesn't matter. 6 months ago, not now, 80% of Iraqis said they had no confidence in U.S., UK forces or in the civilian authorities. Now, of course, much worse. But none of this has any relevance to the Messianic vision. Well, Iraqis can also observe the economic measures that are being imposed by the current proconsul, Paul Bremer, answerable to the Pentagon. They, in effect, open up the Iraqi economy and banking system to effective U.S. takeover. Britain will get a few crumbs in honor of its cooperation. The plans were immediately denounced by Iraqi business leaders who pointed out that they would be destroyed. Bremer also imposed a 15% top flat tax, which will make Iraq one of the least taxed countries in the world, completely unable to rebuild the devastated infrastructure from the U.S.-British sanctions and the wars, and to carry out badly needed social spending. That's all gone. Iraqi businesses don't like it, but there should be fewer problems with Iraqi workers. Iraq does have a militant, active labor tradition, despite all the repression. But the occupying army, as soon as they moved in, took immediate action to destroy the unions, broke into union offices, arrested the leaders, blocked strikes by force, enforced Saddam Hussein's brutal anti-labor laws, and handed over concessions to bitterly anti-union U.S. businesses. These economic proposals, incidentally, are completely familiar. Those are the kind that created the Third World. The Third World was compelled by force to accept market discipline. The rich countries, England, the United States, Germany, up to Japan and East Asia, the ones that developed, they just, they may teach the rules of those principles in graduate economics courses, but they didn't observe them. They relied on a powerful state intervention to drive the economy and protect it. And those are the ones that grew and developed. The ones that had the principles imposed on them by force are what we now call the Third World. So there's nothing unfamiliar about the proposals being made for Iraq. Well, it's an open question whether Iraqis can be coerced into submitting to the nominal sovereignty that's offered under various constitutional fictions designed by the occupying power to block true sovereignty. It's been astonishing to see their resistance to this. I don't mean bombs and guns, which are the least of it, just the steadfast refusal to accept the demands of the occupying powers. That has been extremely impressive, and it's forced them to back down. That's one question. For privileged people in the West, people like us, there's a far more important question, and that is whether we will permit our own government to nurture democracy in the style of idealist-in-chief Paul Wolfowitz, as in their traditional domains, in fact, for a long time. Well, right at this point, crucial questions arise about the nature of Western democracies and their future. These are extremely important topics. They're obviously the most important ones for us, and they're important for everyone because it's quite literally true that the survival of the species is at stake, and the answers to these questions. But those are for some other time. Thank you.
If you had 1 minute with George W. Bush, what would you say beginning now?
To tell you the honest truth, I doubt very much that George Bush has much to do with policy formation. I mean, the way the presidency is more or less like royalty in the United States. So the Queen of England opens Parliament with a speech, right? But nobody asks whether she believes it, or whether she understands it. Her role is it's a ceremonial role. You present, it's a role that's connected with unity of the people, patriotism, obedience, and so on and so forth. The content is something else. That's by people who run the country. The people who run the country are those in political office, but much more importantly, they're associates in the concentrations of private economic power. That's where the country's really run. And that shouldn't be a big secret either. America's leading social philosopher, John Dewey, who's right, very mainstream American, he pointed out once that as long as we have what he called industrial feudalism rather than industrial democracy, that means tyrannical, totalitarian institutions running the economy, command economies basically. As long as that's, instead of industrial democracy, like workers' control and management, as long as we have that, then politics will be the shadow cast by business over society. And that's approximately accurate. I mean, it's not that the state has no independent choices, it does, but an amalgam. Exactly the role that George Bush plays in this is very dubious, questionable. In some cases, like say Ronald Reagan, he probably didn't even know what the policies were. He was reading off his note cards or the teleprompter or something like that. And Bush may have some knowledge of them, but I think he's mostly a ceremonial figure, trained to act in certain ways and so on. So if I had a minute with him, I would say, have you talked to God lately or something like that?
We have a question from Dan Rigby, a two-part question. If John Kerry wins the presidency, will it make any difference in Iraq? And should Ralph Nader still stand?
If Kerry wins, which I think is unlikely, just looking at the relative funding of the two candidates, and elections are mostly bought, but suppose he does. I doubt if it would make much of a difference in Iraq. Their policies, it's very hard to know what Kerry's policies are. He's been very careful not to, his advisors have been very careful not to formulate them. But chances are it would be more like Albright and Clinton. That is, same policies, but not so stupidly and arrogantly formulated and implemented, which is a difference. And in a huge system of power like the United States, those small differences can translate into large outcomes. The major difference between the two, I think, would be domestic. The Bush administration are real extremists. It's a narrow political spectrum, but they're way out at an extreme. They want to simply, and they're pretty brazen and open about it again, they want to dismantle everything that has been achieved by popular struggle over the last century. Everything from the limited measures of social welfare, support systems, pensions, minimal medical care, to progressive taxation. In fact, about anything you can think of. They want to create a real utopia for the masses. Very powerful state, they're not conservatives, a very powerful state which serves the rich and powerful and somehow controls everybody else, one or another means. There is a kind of a quasi-fascist strain there. I don't like to use the term, but it's there. Except that the fascists did develop welfare systems, and they want to destroy those. And the Kerry will be less extreme in this respect, just as Clinton was less extreme. And those make big differences too. Like, you have a disabled mother you have to take care of. It makes a difference how extreme the policies are. Those differences, I think, are significant. That gets to the Nader question. My feeling is that it should be a very high priority to keep Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, those characters, prevent them from getting another mandate. If they do, they can be extremely dangerous in every respect. The difference between militarizing space under the conception of control and militarizing it under the conception of ownership may be the difference between survival of the species and non-survival. Neither is very attractive, but there are differences. And the same is true on the domestic front and to a limited extent elsewhere. So I do think it's a priority. Nader doesn't. I like him, known him for a long time. I like what he stands for and does, but I really think he's making a mistake. Actually, what he ought to do, in my opinion, and actually there are things he could do to be in the campaign and not affect the outcome. There's some technical things he could do. Actually, one of them was proposed by a well-known constitutional law professor at Yale University, Bruce Anderson, and it's an interesting suggestion. In the U.S. system, you don't elect people, you elect electors. Okay? And the electors elect the people, the candidates. That was part of the original Madisonian system to try to marginalize the public and keep power in the hands of the wealthy. Now it doesn't have quite that function, but the system is still there, which means that Nader could, if he wanted to, run, but select the Democratic electors. That would mean you're voting for Nader, but the elector is Kerry's. Okay, so that's a way to run and use the opportunity to say whatever you want and bring issues up and so on and so forth, but not affect the election. I mean, that's one way to do it, and there are other ways. And my opinion is that's what he ought to do. It's fine to bring up issues and discuss things and so on and so forth, but to act so as to bring back into office the people around Bush, which is exactly what it is, that's just not sensible in my opinion.
Yeah, Ron Senchak, former U.S. Navy from Newark, New Jersey, first became political in the Vietnam War, went in, saluted the flag and came out burning it. And I've been very active in Manchester in the Stop the War Coalition. We've got over 20,000 people on the streets and we're still going strong here. But I did want to ask you the differences that you might see between the anti-war movement in the 60s and the early 70s and the anti-war movement now. I think it's much more, I'm optimistic. People around the world are talking about a different world now, much more than they were before, and I'm optimistic.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, in the 1960s, we kind of forget, but the anti-war movement didn't exist for years after the war in Vietnam began. Literally didn't exist. I mean, there was so little opposition to Kennedy's attack on South Vietnam that nobody even remembers that it took place. I mean, you have to study to find out it took place, but it did. In 1962, Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, initiated chemical warfare in South Vietnam, which has an estimated 600,000 victims. It's not small. Started rounding up people, programs to round up ultimately millions of people in what amounted to concentration camps, and that then just escalated, and there was no protest at all. You know, I mean, no American president could even dream of doing that today, and that's because of the activism that developed later in the 60s and even more so in the 70s and 80s and 90s, which has just changed the country, changed consciousness enormously. I mean, finally, an anti-war movement did develop in the United States, and same in Britain, I should say. Anti-war activism here was extremely low in the 60s, virtually non-existent. I remember very well because I was flown over by leaders of the anti-war movement here through the 60s because they needed somebody to give a talk, you know. This went on for a long time. By the late 60s, it had developed, it had become big, but kind of narrow. It expanded enormously afterwards. I mean, the major popular movements that one thinks of as movements of the 60s, the main ones that really influenced the society and changed it are not from the 60s. They're from the 70s and the 80s. So take, say, the women's movement. That barely existed in the 60s. I mean, it really took off in the 70s. It's had an enormous effect on the whole society. The environmental movement didn't exist in the 60s. It came later. The anti-nuclear movements, the solidarity movements are mostly in the 80s, and they're by now huge. Well, you get back to this war. This war is unique in the history of Europe, hundreds of years. European imperialism, including the United States. It's the first time in European history or American history that there was massive protest against a war before it was launched. I can't think of any historical example of that. Where there was any protest against a war before it was launched, let alone massive protest. Well, that's an indication of very big changes in popular understanding and consciousness. And you can be certain that people in power know it. Here are other things that aren't told you very often, but you can find them if you want. The Pentagon Papers were very interesting and unusual in that it was not declassified, it was stolen. So it's like getting the archives of a conquered country, you know, where they don't have a chance to purify them. So the Pentagon Papers are rather revealing. The Pentagon Papers run from the late 40s to 1968, the end in 1968. The last part of the Pentagon Papers is right after the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 convinced American business elites that the war isn't worth it. They've already won. They've already destroyed South Vietnam. There isn't going to be any successful defiance or any effect on others. So it's just a waste of money and time. And they essentially ordered the government, ordered Lyndon Johnson to call the war off. He was informed not to run for office, stop the bombing of North Vietnam, enter into negotiations, and he obediently followed the orders. But after the Tet Offensive, right afterwards, Johnson did want to send 200,000 more troops to South Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs of Staff objected, and the reasons they objected, which are described in the last pages of the Pentagon Papers, is that they said if they continued the war, they would need those troops in the United States for civil disorder control, because they would not be able to control constituencies that were out of control, and they mentioned them. Young people, women, minorities, others, they're just not going to control them. So they're going to need the troops right in the United States, and they refused to send them. Well, that's important. There was already a record. By that time, the military, top military, wanted the Army out. They were trying to get the Army out of Vietnam. Remember, then it was a civilian army. It was not a professional army. It's one of the reasons they shifted to a professional army, which is kind of like a mercenary army of the disadvantaged, is what it comes out to. The United States made a bad mistake in Vietnam. It's the first time an imperial power tried to fight a colonial war with a citizen's army. Now, that doesn't work. That's why the British used Gurkhas and Indians in Afghanistan and stuff like that. That's why the French have a foreign legion. I mean, every sensible imperial power uses mercenaries, usually local mercenaries from one part of the country moving to another and that sort of thing. But the U.S. tried to carry out a straight, traditional imperial war of destruction with a citizen's army. And civilians just they can't do that, you know. I mean, sometimes they go off to extreme barbarism, but they just can't deal with this kind of situation. You really need professional killers for that, like the French Foreign Legion. I mean, they can do it. And in fact, civilians are also too integrated with the home society. So what's going on in, say, the youth culture in the United States in the late 60s was affecting the soldiers. I was getting to the point where soldiers were killing their officers, they were going off on drugs, and this. The Army really thought the Army was going to disintegrate, and they wanted them out. Well, that's another change. In 1980, when any president comes into office, first thing he does is call for an intelligence analysis of the world situation, obviously. Usually we don't find out about it for 30 or 40 years until it gets declassified. But in 1989, when Bush #1 came in, somebody in the Pentagon leaked a piece of it, or in the CIA. A small piece of it was leaked and barely published. I mean, it's there, but if you find it, it was interesting. It had to do with military intervention. Specifically, it had to do with what they called wars against much weaker enemies. And of course, if you're semi-rational, that's the only kind of war you ever get involved in. So what it said is, in the case of conflicts with much weaker enemies, the United States must win rapidly and decisively, because otherwise political support will erode. Like, it's not the 1960s any longer, where you can go on for year after year smashing up a country and destroying it and nobody even bats an eyelash. Now, that's the problem they're facing in Iraq. I mean, if it was the 1960s, early 60s, I mean, they'd just send the B-52s and destroy the place, and there wouldn't be any problem. But they can't do that anymore. They don't have the options that Kennedy and Johnson had. You have to win rapidly and decisively, or else political support disappears. Well, that's change. I mean, it's not utopia, you know, but it's a significant change. And I agree exactly with what you say. These trajectories are very optimistic. I mean, you've got to make sure they go on.
Do you think there's a link between political Islam and terrorism, as the secular fundamentalists, the UK government and the US government would have us believe?
There's not going to be much time to talk about this, but there is some very good work on it. For example, there's a recent book by Mahmoud Mamdani, a Ugandan scholar at Columbia, exactly on this topic, just came out. And what he points out is that what the West calls terrorism is political Islam. I mean, it was secular. It was a secular political movement for a long time. but the secular political movement was just smashed. I mean, it was partly by outside force, partly by internal corruption. I mean, whatever the reason, the secular political Islam just didn't succeed. And people don't just give up hope at that point. They learn something else. And what they turn to is religious extremist Islam, which indeed was fostered by the same people who destroyed political Islam. So the United States and Britain and others destroyed political Islam by a good deal of violence. It wasn't the only cause, but it was a significant one. And they also fostered the religious fanatic Islam. I mean, the obvious case is Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's not a big secret. Who organized the Islamic jihadis in the 1980s? CIA, British intelligence, Pakistani intelligence. They scoured the world to find the most radical Islamic extremists they could find and brought them to Afghanistan and trained them and armed them and gave them Stinger missiles and the rest of it. The purpose was not to defend Afghanistan, which could have been a legitimate purpose. In fact, doing it probably prolonged the war in Afghanistan, delayed the Russian departure. Russian archives now show the purpose was quite different. It was to bleed the Russians. That's not legitimate. And in fact, they were carrying out terrorist acts inside Russia in the 1980s. Serious ones that almost led to a war between Russia and Pakistan, which would have been a nuclear war. After they had done their job of bleeding the Russians, the West figured, okay, we'll forget about them. But they didn't go away. They went back to their own countries or other places, and that's what's become the Al-Qaeda style phenomenon. It finally turned against the West for reasons we know. And it's a form of political Islam. And that's happened in country after country. I mean, take, say, the Israeli-occupied one of the arguments against, part of the Syria Accountability Act, I don't have time to go into it, is the claim that Syria is allowing offices of Hamas and Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, to stay there. Well, where did Hezbollah and Hamas come from? They come from Israel. I mean, Israel created both of them. In the case of Hamas, it did it consciously. I mean, in the occupied territories, Israel was supporting religious extremists in order to undermine the secular PLO, the political Islam. It wasn't even Islam very much. It was a political, secular movement seeking independence for the Palestinians. Well, that was the real threat. Israel preferred secular religious extremists. One of the only, I think maybe the only university in the West Bank that Israel sort of allowed to be funded was the Islamic University. At one point, they were busing students from the Islamic University to Birzeit, the secular university, to break up strikes, protests. Where'd Hezbollah come from? Did you ever hear of them before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon? I mean, they're the result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, backed by the U.S., otherwise they can't do it. That was a vicious invasion. I mean, killed about 20,000 people, destroyed a large part of southern Lebanon, led to resistance, and the resistance ended up being Hezbollah, which drove them out of Lebanon, and is now becoming a kind of political organization in Lebanon. Well, those are the purpose of the invasion of Lebanon. It was pretty open. I mean, it was expressed by the highest political military echelons. The purpose of the invasion of Lebanon was to eliminate PLO efforts at negotiation and political accommodation, which were just becoming embarrassing. It was very hard to fend them off. So they wanted to drive them out of Lebanon so they can forget about it. In fact, it was called by the chief of staff and others, the Lebanon war was called a war for the West Bank. I mean, there's a kind of a pretense in the West that Israel was reacting to PLO, rocket Katyusha bombings of northern Israel and so on. That's complete lies. I mean, total lies. I mean, if you read the Western scholarly literature, what they say is that for a year before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the border was quiet. Okay, the statement, the border was quiet, is a racist euphemism for the fact that the border was anything but quiet, except that the attacks were coming from south to north. I mean, Israel was bombing Lebanon, it was sinking ships in harbors, it was murdering people and so on, in an effort, increasingly desperate effort, to elicit some Palestinian reaction that could be used as a pretext for an invasion. When they didn't get a pretext, they invaded anyway. That's called the border is quiet, meaning our guys aren't getting killed. But the actual reason was to try to undermine a political, secular, not even, Islamic and Christian movement just calling for Palestinian independence. End result, Hezbollah. In the occupied territories, end result, Hamas. In Iraq, end result, Muqtada al-Sadr. In Algeria, it was the same kind of development. I mean, in Algeria, after the French left Algeria, they didn't go away. I mean, they penetrated the Algerian security services, the government, and so on. And probably they are responsible for a large part of the massive atrocities of the last 10 years. And one result of all of that is Islamic fundamentalist radicalism in Algeria. I mean, this happens all the time, not just in the Islamic world, elsewhere too. And people do not just say, okay, I quit when you destroy some political option. They find some other way. And often the other way is not very pretty. And often it's fostered by those who ultimately suffer from it. So yes, I think political Islam is the right word for it.
Okay, we have one last question. This is a question from Tom Conte. The question is, do you live in hope or despair? What inspires you about Western political activism? And what do you think it's lacking today?
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter. I mean, whether you have hope or despair is kind of like a personal matter between you and your wife and children or something. Maybe not even that. It just doesn't matter. You do exactly the same thing, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. Okay, so it really doesn't matter. It's a subjective question. But I think there's reason for hope for the reason that he pointed out before. There is a very definite trajectory which is positive. I mean, there's plenty of things that are horrible. We should talk about them. We're not trying to compliment ourselves on how wonderful we are. So you pay attention to what's wrong and try to fix it, and there's plenty. But the fact of the matter is that there's tremendous improvement in the general level of civilization in Western societies. Things that were simply taken for granted not many years ago are now intolerable, literally intolerable. It's not just in international affairs. I mean, take something like domestic abuse, okay? I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't even, that's life. What's there to talk about? So it was not an issue. Now it's a very big issue. And there's protection and understanding and so on. It hasn't gone, hasn't disappeared, but it's a lot better than it was. And the same is true of everything else. Across the board, there's now awareness and understanding of things that were just taken for granted as the way life is. I mean, I don't know this university, but I suspect it's Manchester, but I imagine it's kind of the same as MIT. At my own university. If you walk down the halls at MIT today, it's 50% women, about a third minorities. People are casually dressed, which reflects informal relationships among people without deference to authority and so on. If you'd walk down the same halls 40 years ago, white males, well-dressed, obedient, maybe 2 or 3 women and a couple of thousand people and so on. Well, this is more than symbolism. These are changes in the nature of the society. And those changes are going on. And we can foster them. They mean that today there is a basis for education and organizing that is much more advanced than it was not many years ago. And still plenty of problems, but you could start from a higher plane. And there are plenty of opportunities. I mean, just to finish, Take something like, say, the World Social Forum. I mean, this is, again, completely unprecedented in history. I mean, there were attempts to develop what were called internationals, but they were very narrow, and they collapsed for reasons you know. This is the first organization which has the prospects, perhaps, of being a genuine international. As I'm sure you know, it's meeting in the South, like it meets in Brazil and India. The reason is because that's where the activism is. These things were initiated in the South, and very successfully. Big popular movements, lots of activism. Finally, the North sort of was drawn in on the periphery. And if you read about, when you read about it, you read, well, it began in Seattle. That's because if 500,000 people demonstrate in India, it didn't happen. But if something happens in a northern city, it happened, you know. So therefore, Seattle is talked about as the beginning. No, it's not. It's the end, you know. But it's important that the northern countries were drawn in. And now there is an international network of activists. It spawned 100,000 people show up of all kind, you know, every imaginable kind of activist you can think of. It's now spawned regional and local social forums all over the place, which have the same general conception of what the world is and where they're going, but are looking at local problems, which is correct. They should be looking at what's right next to them. Those are all very healthy developments. They've never happened before. There's never been anything like them. And it does give a basis for moving on.
To say I'm impressed with this college. It's the first, I don't know how many colleges I've talked about over the years, but this is the first one I've ever heard of where it has enough money so that the police can actually tow people who are illegally parked. That's got to be impressive. Well, I was asked to talk, the title I was given, I guess it's the one that's on some handout you have, is the onslaught against freedom and democracy led by the Bush administration reactionaries. It's always nice to have a nice neutral title that makes no presuppositions or assumptions. So that'll work. But and being obedient, that's what I'll talk about. Though would have been interesting to, maybe there'll be time later to talk about the main concerns of the anti-corporate clearinghouse, which are, in my view at least, a much greater threat to democracy than the topic I'm going to talk about, which is bad enough. This topic, there can easily, for convenience, break it up into two aspects, the domestic and the international aspects of the assault on freedom and democracy, called the defense of freedom and democracy. The domestic side, the first thing that comes to mind is the recent legislation that's been enacted in the last couple of years and the new additions that are being planned, the main one being the Patriot Act, Patriot 1, which was rammed through very quickly without any scrutiny, exploiting the circumstances immediately after 9/11. And the next one, which isn't passed, though its text was leaked, you've probably seen it, often called Patriot 2, So far, Patriot 2 has been blocked by rather extensive protest. John Ashcroft, as I'm sure you know, had been a couple of weeks ago traveling around the country. Almost surely his intent was to build up support for the Patriot 2 Act, but to his surprise, he found he was greeted with so much protest and opposition about Patriot 1 that he had to spend all of his time trying to defend Patriot 1. And Patriot 2, as far as we know, is still on the back burner, but they'll try to sneak it through in some other fashion. As for Patriot 1, I won't try to review the content of it. I'm sure you know it. Instead of reviewing the content, I'll just quote a comment on it by one of the heroes of Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and the rest. In his words, the power of the executive to cast a man in prison without formulating any charge known to the law, and particularly to deny him the judgment of his peers, is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. That actually is a pretty exact description of the content of Patriot 1. The man who wrote the words, George Bush looks at every morning. He has a bust on his desk of this revered figure given to him by his friend Tony Blair. The man's name is Winston Churchill, and he was warning about abuses of executive power for intelligence and preventive purposes. The year was 1943, when England was facing annihilation at the hands of the most murderous, brutal regime in history. But nonetheless, Churchill warned severely against the odious practices that are the foundations of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist, and that are enacted in Patriot 1 under far less onerous conditions. So Churchill's words place the Bush administration in its proper historical context, as their great hero perceives it, I think quite accurately. The act has been implemented, but there's been so much resistance to it that the implementation so far is against vulnerable, weak people. That's bad enough. Could be a lot worse, but they haven't been able to make it worse. It's been upheld by the courts to a large extent, the lower courts at least, who have agreed with the administration claim that the executive shall have the right to cast a man in prison without formulating any charge known to the law, to deny him the judgment of his peers, in Churchill's words, and to do it indefinitely, without charge, without access to family and lawyers, including American citizens, and at the whim of the executive, last as long as the executive branch agrees, as long as we have an executive that is committed to the policies that are in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. That's serious enough, but we should also look at it in perspective. I mean, it's not, by far not, the most severe attack on civil liberties by the executive in U.S. history. So, for example, it doesn't begin to compare with what happened during Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare at the end of the First World War, when thousands of people were kicked out of the country, many arrested, labor movement completely smashed, independent thought almost terminated, many people jailed, among them the leading figure in the U.S. labor movement ever, Eugene Debs, also a presidential candidate. He was charged by Woodrow Wilson with having given a talk in which he questioned the nobility of Wilson's war. So he was tossed into jail, and in an exercise of what's called Wilsonian idealism, Wilson refused even to amnesty him a couple of years after the war when there was a general amnesty. Well, we're nowhere near that. I mean, that laid a pall over the next decade and start coming out of it till the middle of the Depression. It's also what's happening now nowhere near as severe as the COINTELPRO operations that were carried out more recently through the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. These were secret operations carried out by the National Political Police, the FBI, which primarily is concerned with crushing political dissent and has been since its origins when it was established during Wilson's Red Scare. And these operations were not at all trivial. In part, they were aimed at destroying a legal political party, small, therefore vulnerable, but just as legal as the Democrats or the Republicans, namely the Socialist Workers' Party. Offices were raided by the FBI, files stolen, names distributed in efforts to keep people from gaining employment, various other forms of harassment. It went on to target the women's movement, all the black movements, the entire New Left. Actions went as far as outright political assassination. The most extreme case was an FBI-organized, really Gestapo-style assassination of a black organizer, Fred Hampton. They also killed somebody else, Mark Clark, in a staged attack by the Chicago police under FBI direction. 4 a.m., murdered him in his bed, both of them. And it wasn't trivial by any means. This was exposed at exactly the same time that Watergate was exposed. And the comparison is quite interesting and tells you a lot about the operative values in the educated sectors, the intellectual classes and the society and the press as well. So if you do a poll and ask how many people have heard of Watergate and how many have heard of COINTELPRO, you know what the answer will be. Watergate was simply a tea party as compared with COINTELPRO. It was triviality. Almost nothing happened. It was bad. It shouldn't have happened, but it should be a minor footnote in the history of repression. However, it was dealt with as if it's destroying the foundations of the Republic, whereas COINTELPRO, which was incomparably more serious, in fact, the actions against the Socialist Workers' Party alone were far more serious than the entire Watergate incident, and that was the least of it. It was stopped by the courts, theoretically, it may still be going on, but it was formally terminated by the courts, and it's of no interest to anyone. So what's the difference between COINTELPRO and Watergate? Well, in the case of Watergate, the people who were targeted, nothing ever happened to them, but the people who were targeted were powerful. In fact, the Democratic Party is roughly half the power in the country. And you don't call powerful people bad names. If you do that, you get thrown out of office, which is exactly what happened to Nixon, for nothing. On the other hand, the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon actions leading all the way to political assassination on Nixon's beat is of no concern to anyone because the people who are targeted aren't powerful people. So therefore you can do anything you like to them. And that does tell us a lot about the operative values. And that remains so. That's the way history is written. You read about Watergate, you don't hear about COINTELPRO. Well, COINTELPRO was incomparably worse than what's happening now, and it helps to put it in perspective. Part of the reason is that the society is just more civilized now as a result of the activism of the 1960s and the aftermath. People just act differently, see things differently, don't accept things they used to accept. Which is good. That's true in all kinds of domains. Makes organizing a lot easier than it was then. and it makes repression a lot harder. That's to the good, and we should bear that in mind. Well, we should also bear in mind that whatever happens here, whether it's the Red Scare, or COINTELPRO, or Patriot 1, or Patriot 2, which I should mention that if Patriot 2 sneaks through, it's going to be a lot worse. Patriot 2 goes way beyond anything that's ever been proposed in any remotely democratic society. It, for example, grants the executive the right to remove citizenship without charge, just on the decision of the Attorney General, who doesn't even have to refer to actions. He just has to, as the text puts it, infer from a pattern of behavior that the person deserves to have his citizenship taken away. Nothing like that's ever been dreamt of in anything that calls itself a democratic society, and it almost went through. My suspicion is they were trying to sneak it through under cover of the Iraq War, more or less the way Patriot 1 was sneaked through, but there was enough resistance, so they had to back off, but we'll hear from it again. Anyway, all of these things, whatever they may be, don't amount to very much as compared with what people face in other societies. And it's important to bear in mind that, including, for example, just to illustrate, just take the society, the countries that are the leaders in receiving U.S. military aid. I'll put aside Israel and Egypt, which are a totally separate category. But outside of Israel and Egypt, right through the 90s, through the liberal period, the Clinton period, and today, the leading recipients of U.S. military aid were Turkey and Colombia. Turkey, because it was carrying out a murderous counterinsurgency campaign against its miserably repressed Kurdish population, with millions of people driven out of their homes, the countryside devastated, tens of thousands of people killed, every barbaric form of torture you can imagine. I've actually visited some of the indescribable slums in Istanbul where refugees are trying to survive in virtually demolished buildings or in the caves of walls in towns in southeastern Turkey. Actually, the latest terrorist activities in Turkey are traced to that region so far, which is possibly true. If you treat people like that long enough, all kind of awful things happen. As the terrorist atrocities, state terror increased, U.S. military aid increased until the point where Turkey became the world leader. In the year 1997 alone, Clinton sent as much military aid to Turkey as the entire Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency campaign. It's pretty brutal. And furthermore, the laws of the country are harsh and brutal as well. But intellectuals there are very different from those in the West, completely different. They not only constantly leading writers, journalists, publishers, artists, academics, not only constantly protest the laws, but are engaged in regular civil disobedience against them, and are facing and sometimes enduring quite severe punishment. State security courts don't even have a resemblance to courts. I've been in them, in fact. But they do it, and they do it unpretentiously, simply, daily, always at it. That's the kind of thing that people face in the world. The second leading recipient of U.S. military aid, now the first leading one since 1999, is Colombia, by far the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, by far the leading recipient of U.S. military aid during the Clinton years, correlated. By now, it's reached the level of, well, they claim, about 20 political assassinations a day. Again, a huge number of people, well over 1 million, one of the biggest displaced populations in the world, driven off the land into urban slums. A lot of it's done by chemical warfare under the guise of drug eradication, which we have absolutely no right to do in the first place, even if that were the goal, and it's not. And people there are facing really severe dangers, like the danger of political assassination, constant danger, but they keep at it. Again, priests, academics, human rights activists, lawyers, journalists. They're there every day doing the same things. We should bear that in mind when we think about the threats that people are concerned about here. They're not trivial by any means, but by international standards, they don't amount to much. And that's particularly true in the countries where we're responsible for imposing those conditions, which everyone would know about if in fact, intellectuals here should be humiliated by the regular behavior of their counterparts in countries like, say, Turkey and Colombia, and they would be humiliated by it if they knew about it. But fortunately, we have a free press, so nobody knows about it. And that's not insignificant. Well, there are other facts that nobody knows about thanks to the free press and the educated community in general, of which the press is a pretty fair representation. So everybody knows George Bush's famous statement that right after 9/11, that we are going to treat any nation that harbors terrorists as a terrorist state, meaning we'll bomb and destroy them. Oddly, Bush was not sent to Guantanamo for making that statement because he was calling for the bombing of the United States, clearly and explicitly. There is not the slightest doubt that the United States harbors terrorists. Incidentally, about 2/3 of the population agrees with Bush that we should bomb the United States. 2/3 of the population believes that we should bomb any country, has a right, any country, not just the United States, has a result to attack a country that is harboring people who are planning or executing terrorist attacks against it. Well, that means quite a long list of countries should be setting off bombs in Washington and New York, according to 2/3 of the population. Who are the terrorists who are harbored here? Well, begin right at the top. The administration is almost entirely recycled from the Reagan and Bush 1 administration. They have the honor to be the only administration in the world that has been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, again, in their war against Nicaragua, which, of course, they dismissed the court judgment and immediately escalated the war, in fact, officially directing their forces to attack what they called soft targets, undefended civilian targets. Vetoed a Security Council resolution affirming the court judgment and calling on all states to observe international law. And in fact, that's sort of the least of it, but that's one case. So yes, there's terrorists continuing to direct policy, but let's just keep to the people who the FBI and the Justice Department call terrorists, just that category. Are we harboring them? Well, all over the country, in fact. Most dramatically, though not only, in Miami, the scene of recent state terror activities, which you probably know about. So take, say, Orlando Bosch, who, according to the FBI and the Justice Department, is responsible for, they identify about 30 terrorist acts, some of them quite severe, like blowing up an airliner and killing 73 people, and a lot of others. The INS was planning to deport him as a threat to the United States. The Justice Department supported that. They said that allowing him to stay in this country is a threat to the national security of the United States. But they were overruled by George Bush #1, who granted him a presidential pardon at the request of Jeb Bush, governor of Florida. So he's living happily in Miami, which of course and continuing to be involved quite openly in planning of execution of terrorist actions, which have been going on it's now on to 45 years. In the early years, directly run from Washington, especially during the Kennedy administration, more recently run by terrorists who we harbor here, which surely gives Cuba, just as it gives Nicaragua, others, the right to bomb the United States, according to George Bush and 2/3 of the population. The terrorist war against Cuba is not at all trivial. It's quite apart from what it's done to Cubans. It almost led to a nuclear war, came very close. It was a major factor behind the missile crisis. Kennedy renewed the terrorist attacks right after the missile crisis and practically up to the day of his assassination. All of this is pretty serious, and it's continuing. And the aftermath is interesting up till today. I mean, humiliating for us, but interesting. We should know about it. So a couple of years ago, the Cubans decided to try to infiltrate the terrorist organizations in Florida to figure out what they're up to, what their plans are. They do carry out regular, constant attacks. And they did. They got a lot of information. The FBI was invited by the Cuban government to go to Havana. They did. They sent some of their top agents to Havana. I think the second highest person in the FBI went to Havana, where they were provided with detailed information, about 1,000 pages, hours of videotapes and so on planning of terrorist actions in Florida, mainly Miami. And they thanked the Cubans for having given them this information about terrorist acts being organized and implemented from U.S. territory, and they acted on it. A couple of weeks later, they did send people to courts and finally prison, namely the ones who had infiltrated the terrorist organizations. They were brought to trial. The government insisted on trying them in Miami because in Miami it's a certainty that you can't have a fair trial. You look at the jury, it was all mad anti-Cuban terrorists. The prosecution case was so awful that the judge instructed the jury to disregard it, but they sentenced them anyway, 2 sentenced to life imprisonment, 3 others to long prison sentences. A lot of the time in solitary confinement. The U.S. government won't allow visas for their families to visit them. So for the crime of exposing terrorist actions on U.S. soil, they are now in jail. How many people know about this? Well, Cuba, they certainly know. Latin America, everybody knows. In the United States, nobody knows, except those who are involved in the support committees for the Cuban Five, as they're called. Again, a triumph of the freedom of the press, a particularly ironic case, and in this case, given the fuss about terrorism and the talk about harboring terrorists. Well, we could go on, but instead let's continue to something else, still keeping to the free press. The most serious violations that Churchill condemned are not carried out on home soil, but rather in Guantanamo. That is really a major atrocity and scandal. It's been bitterly condemned all over the world. It was condemned very harshly by the Justice Department's own Inspector General, but of course that was dismissed. Human rights organizations have report after report about it. I won't go on because you can easily find it out if you don't know already, as you should. That's extremely serious. What's that about? Well, the most important aspect is not so much what's happening to the people detained there without charge permanently, so on. That's bad enough. But more serious is another fact, namely, what's the United States doing in Guantanamo? Guantanamo is illegally occupied territory. It's part of Cuba, which the United States simply stole when it conquered Cuba under the guise of liberation in 1898. Technically, Cuba agreed to give the United States a permanent lease to Guantanamo, which is about as valid as the Vichy government giving the rights to the Nazis to a permanent military bases in France when they were under military occupation. but it's considered quite legitimate here. The holding on to Guantanamo means that the U.S. keeps the best port in Cuba and prevents any development in the eastern part of the island. That's part of the effort at economic strangulation of Cuba, which has gone on also for almost 45 years. And that's also been bitterly condemned. Every relevant international forum has condemned it. The only reason the World Trade Organization didn't condemn it is because the U.S. refused to allow a European Union case to be heard. It just walked out, said we're not going to listen to it. So that was the end of that one. Everywhere else it's been condemned. Even the Organization of American States, which is very careful. They don't want to offend the mafia don who runs the hemisphere. It's too dangerous. But in this case, they went as far just a few months ago as refusing to allow the United States to serve on the Human Rights Commission of the OAS. Symbolic, of course, but significant as an indication of the anger about both this and other things like the Cuban Five and more. And that's all over the world the same, except here where nobody knows about it. So virtually nobody here knows, again, you can try a poll, that just 2 weeks ago, I guess, the General Assembly of the United Nations once again condemned the illegal economic warfare, this time by a vote of 179 to 3. The 3 were the United States, Israel, which votes reflexively with the United States, and a Pacific island. There was an abstention. Morocco abstained because although most of the countries of the world, all the countries of the West, condemn Morocco's illegal occupation of the Western Sahara, Cuba is the only country that does so in a principled way, so therefore Morocco abstained in the vote. This was barely mentioned in the United States, just as it is almost always barely mentioned, because we're not supposed to know things like that. We're not supposed to know how the world reacts to illegal U.S. actions designed to strangle and, in fact, in this case, also terrorize a country for reasons that are understood. It's a very free country, the United States. We have a huge documentary record. It's all come out triumph of U.S. democracy that we have such records. It's not a triumph of U.S. democracy that nobody knows about it. That's different. That's a condemnation of the educational system and the media and so on. But if you look at the records, which are available, you find the reasons. It had nothing to do with the Russians. It was because of what they called 40 years ago Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years, namely to the Monroe Doctrine, which established that the U.S. runs the hemisphere. And Cuba was carrying out successful defiance of this, and therefore they should be subject to massive terrorism, economic strangulation, leading right up to the present. Well, that's what you can know if you want to find out. As I say, these things are perfectly well known in Latin America, as are many other things. So, for example, in Latin America, rarely here, there were plenty of commemorations last couple of weeks ago of what's called in Latin America the other 9/11, namely the 30 years ago, the bombing of the presidential palace in Chile, which led immediately to the death of, by very conservative estimates, about 3,000 people, probably many more than that. 3,000 in Chile would be the equivalent of about 60,000 in the United States, and we might consider it significant if 60,000 people were killed in the United States in a day of terror, but here it's not significant, primarily because the U.S. was instrumental in carrying out the terror, so therefore it didn't happen. That's let alone what happened later. However, for the rest of the world it happened, and in particular in Latin America it happened, and they know about it. Well, that's an opening to the second aspect, freedom and democracy abroad. The current administration is called often neo-Reaganite. It's a good term because they are mostly recycled from the Reagan administration or the Bush 1 administration. The term neo-Reaganite in the media, professional literature, and so on, that refers to what the New York Times called Reagan's yearning for democracy, which is now fortunately revived. So once again, we have a yearning for democracy. It was revived most recently in a speech by George Bush a couple of weeks ago, in which he announced that the United States is dedicated to democracy in Iraq, in the Middle East, all over the world, organizing a new crusade for democracy, a real turning point in American policy. Well, that speech was greeted in the U.S. by commentators and to some extent in England with reverential awe, particular awe for the leading visionary who's running the crusade, Paul Wolfowitz. There's an interesting column. There are many, but one that I recommend to you if you haven't seen it is in the Washington Post on November 2nd by their leading political commentator, long-time political analyst, David Ignatius. While you're reading it, you have to keep pinching yourself to remind yourself that you're not in North Korea, but have a look. It's worth looking at, tells you something about the country. A great awe for this magnificent declaration and for what it proves, namely that the invasion of Iraq was the noblest war in history, undertaken for purely altruistic motives, just to bring democracy to suffering people. The awe was particularly directed at Paul Wolfowitz, described as a grand visionary, whose heart bleeds for the suffering, I'm quoting it, his heart bleeds for the suffering of Arabs. It's why he does such wonderful things. So it continues. There actually was, a couple of days later, by accident, the Washington Post published a poll just taken in Iraq in which people were asked, among other things, why they thought the United States, they didn't use the word invade, whatever they said, but why the United States invaded Iraq. And there were people who agreed with the Washington Post and David Ignatius that the U.S. entered to bring democracy, 1%. So it wasn't zero. Interesting fact, one of many. But we might ask why. How come? Or we might ask how other people reacted in the Middle East. Well, they reacted with complete ridicule. In fact, all over the world, outside the United States and to a little limited extent England, the reaction to Bush's speech was simply ridicule. How can that be? If we greet it with awe and reverence, probably the reason is that other people don't understand that the magnificence of the United States is true by definition, so facts just don't matter. And they may have looked at the facts. For example, some of them may actually have read Bush's speech, where he listed countries of the Middle East and ranked them in terms of their progress toward democracy. Well, as was very quickly pointed out, the ranking had absolutely nothing to do with their progress toward democracy. In fact, it was often the opposite. But it had everything to do with whether they were following orders. The more they were following orders, the more they were advancing toward democracy, even if they were increasing torture and so on and so forth. People notice that if they're not properly educated like we are. We don't notice it. Also, it really takes a very good education to miss the fact that there is exactly one elected leader in the Middle East. A leader elected in a reasonably fair election, internationally supervised. Everybody said it's a fair election. His name happens to be Yasser Arafat. He's the one elected leader in the Middle East. Well, how does that get treated by the Bush administration and Paul Wolfowitz and their visionary efforts to bring democracy? Simple, kick him out. Why? because he isn't doing his job. He was allowed to take over on one condition, namely that he control the population and permit Clinton and the Israeli government to carry out the settlement and development operations in the occupied territories, which are gradually integrating it under Israeli control and have to continue. In fact, in Clinton's last year, the year 2000, when everyone was falling over themselves about the magnificence of his offers, which were incidentally never, you never saw one single map of the proposal in the United States because it gives the game away. But in that last year, Clinton's last year, also Barack's last year, settlement activity reached its peak in the occupied territories, meaning building what are called facts on the ground. Well, Arafat's job was to keep the population quiet while this was happening. And as long as he did it, he was just fine. Nobody cared how many people he tortured. Nobody cared about the vast corruption, which was enormous. He could do anything he liked, as long as he did his job, keeping the population quiet. When he failed to do that job, to make the slightest bit of difference that he's popularly elected and agreed to be the most popular political figure, it just doesn't matter. Toss him out, bring in somebody who the U.S. wants, who they agreed quite openly, didn't have any political support, but maybe he would do the job. So that's our contribution to democracy in the last few months in the Middle East. Well, you know, not everyone is as well educated and as disciplined as we are. So they look at this and they look at the speech and they fall into the aisles in laughter. It's one of the problems with lacking education. Another problem they have is that they may have a little historical memory. So, for example, there may be people who can actually remember something as far back as, say, 4 or 5 months ago, when quite an interesting episode took place in the United States. I can't even think of an analog to it. I mean, there was a display of brazen hatred and contempt for democracy almost throughout the entire spectrum in the U.S., which I just can't think of anything like it. That was the story right before, during the Iraq War, about old Europe and new Europe. You'll remember that. So old Europe are the really bad guys, like France and Germany. And new Europe are the good guys, like Berlusconi and Aznar, who are the grand Churchillian figures leading the world to democracy, in contrast to also some of the East European satellites were allowed in. They were also grand figures, the former Russian satellites. That's New Europe. What was the criterion that distinguished New Europe from Old Europe? I mean, again, it takes a good education not to see it. It was very precise. Old Europe, the bad guys, are the countries where the governments took the same position as the large majority of the population. New Europe, the good guys, or leading the way to democracy, are the countries where the leaders overruled an even larger majority of the population in virtually every case and took their orders from Crawford, Texas. So therefore, they're Democrats. And this passed without a comment, almost. Some of the press was a little honest about it, like the Wall Street Journal, which often is more honest. They have a more trustworthy audience, I guess. So they actually quoted the foreign minister of Latvia, who was asked why Latvia went along with the United States when the population was overwhelmingly opposed. And he said, well, you know, we know that you have to say yes, sir, and do what they tell us to do. They've had some experience with that. And so they understand that that's how you get the democratic credentials. After all, they were a people's democracy, so they know how democracy works. But for the most part, this passed without any comment. Actually, the most interesting case was Turkey. Turkey, about 95% of the population opposed involvement of in the war. And to everyone's amazement, including mine, the Turkish government actually went along with 95% of the population. They were immediately denounced bitterly by Colin Powell, the administration moderate, who announced they were going to be punished by cutting back loans, and so on. Commentators all across the press condemned them for literally lacking democratic credentials. because they were not taking orders from Washington and doing what 95% of the population wanted without a flicker of embarrassment. The most extreme was Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz actually denounced the Turkish military for not intervening as they could to prevent the government from keeping to the will of 95% of the population. That's the visionary leading the way to democracy. Well, it's all there. All you have to do is put it together, and there are people who somehow notice those things. What about Wolfowitz's heart bleeding for the poor, suffering Muslims? That must explain why he was one of the strongest supporters and advocates of General Suharto, first as ambassador under Reagan, and then continuing afterwards as late as 1997, just a couple of months before Suharto was overthrown by an internal revolt. Suharto ranks right along with Saddam Hussein. He's one of the worst mass murderers and torturers of the latter part of the 20th century. But he was doing his job. He was opening up his rich country to Western exploitation. So it didn't matter how many hundreds, thousands of people he killed or how many people were rotting away in jail for decades and being tortured and so on and so forth. Wolfowitz's heart was bleeding for the poor, suffering people by lauding the mass murderer and torturer. That's not the only part of his history. Maybe other people have memory that goes back a little further to the days when he was in Reagan's State Department with responsibility for Asia. So that meant that he was supporting Marcos, dictator Chun in South Korea, both brutal killers and torturers, and right to the end of their rule. I mean, there's now a reconstruction of history, but if you look at the actual history, yes, that's what it was, right to the end until they simply could not be maintained any longer because they were being overthrown by internal revolt. You can't, however, blame him for some other things. So you can't blame him for supporting Duvalier till the end, or Ceausescu, who was easily the counterpart of Saddam Hussein and was supported right to the day of his final overthrow by the Reagan and Bush administration. It's one of their favorites, in fact. Noriega, a rather minor thug who they supported, and quite a cast of quite an interesting rogues gallery. Take a look at the people who are supported by the current incumbents in Washington. It's pretty impressive, right to the time that they were overthrown, strongly supported. And the rogues gallery gets new names every day. So not long ago, the ruler of Equatorial Guinea, Obiang, was welcomed in the White House. Again, terrible torturer and killer, but sitting on a large pool of oil. So he was welcomed, and in fact actually had an election in which he won 97% of the vote. Another current favorite is Karimov in Uzbekistan, who's again properly compared with Saddam Hussein, gotten worse and worse since the US started supporting him. Recently the British ambassador was recalled from Uzbekistan because he had the temerity to condemn the dictator and described, for example, the way he gets rid of his opponents by boiling them to death. So he was taken back to London to teach him some manners. So we can add him. And so it continues without change, right alongside the reverence for the new love of democracy and the visionaries carrying it forward. Well, you also can't blame Wolfowitz for the support of the current incumbents for Saddam Hussein. That's Rumsfeld, Powell, Cheney. Bush 1 administration supported their favorite killer in the region right through his worst atrocities because they didn't care. Now they claim to be upset about them, but not at the time. Continued to support him, provide him with means for developing weapons of mass destruction. Long after the war with Iran, had nothing to do with that. That's another excuse. In fact, they gave the reasons publicly. The reasons were, Bush #1 explained, his administration, the reasons for supporting Saddam after the atrocities, after the war, was our responsibility to American exporters. So it doesn't matter how many people they gas or kill, we have a responsibility to support American exporters. If they want to help them develop weapons of mass destruction, it's our responsibility. If you take a look at the statements, they also added the usual boilerplate about how supporting Saddam Hussein will help improve the human rights situation and bring stability and so on and so forth. All on the public record, right up till the day of the invasion of Kuwait, in fact. Rarely reported, but it's in the public record. And then they returned to support for Saddam in 1991. Now you read, agonized reports of the hideous mass graves that are being unearthed in southern Iraq. Thomas Friedman uses that to demonstrate that it really was a moral war. He's agonizing over the mass graves, which he knew about perfectly well in the spring of 1991. It was perfectly well known. That's when the U.S. authorized Saddam to crush an internal rebellion that might have overthrown him. The reasons were explained in print, for example, by Thomas Friedman, who approved of it, because, as he put it, the best of all worlds for the United States would be an iron-fisted military junta which would rule Iraq just the way Saddam did. He's kind of an embarrassment, but there isn't anyone else who will have to back him. While the main New York Times Middle East correspondent, Alan Cowell, explained that we have to, we're kind of upset about all the slaughter and terror and so on, but there is, he said, a near unanimous view, meaning the U.S. accepts it, that Saddam offers better hope for the stability of Iraq than the people who are trying to overthrow him, meaning we don't want Iraqis to rule Iraq. And if we can't do it, we'd rather have Saddam. All of that's in the papers. You can read it. In 1991, while the mass graves were being filled by Saddam's terror, authorized by the U.S., now the time has come to agonize over them and to talk about how awful this was. And we have to have the noblest war in history because of it. And no one will be so unkind as to mention what the same people wrote when they knew all about it as it was happening. And they could have stopped it if they'd wanted. Well, another tribute to the discipline of properly educated people. You also can't blame Wolfowitz for Africa. That was the specialty of administration moderates like Colin Powell, for example. During the Reagan administration in Africa, in the countries neighboring South Africa, Angola and Mozambique, in those countries, about 1.5 million people were killed and over $60 billion of damage were caused by South African aggression and atrocities, supported by the United States. That's just during the Reagan years. Congress did impose constraints. It legislated sanctions against South Africa, but the Reagan administration found ways around them, and they were able to increase trade and support for South Africa afterwards. Meanwhile, condemning the Nelson Mandela's African National Congress as one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. It was during the period when Powell was National Security Advisor. At the same time, the U.S. undermined the major UN effort to condemn terrorism. There were several, but the major one was in December 1987, a very strong resolution condemning terrorism in all its forms, calling on everyone to do everything possible to stamp out the plague. There were 2 votes against it, the United States and reflexively Israel. 1 country abstained, Honduras, probably the ambassador had a stomachache that day or something. Otherwise unanimous, but effectively vetoed. When the U.S. votes against a resolution, it's vetoed. In fact, doubly vetoed because it's also banned from reporting and banned from history, so it's unknown. Also unknown are the reasons why the United States and Israel banned the resolution against terror. They explained it in the General Assembly debate, again on the public record. The reason was one paragraph which said nothing in this resolution prejudices the right of people to struggle for their freedom under racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation, in accord with the Charter of the United Nations and to gain support from others to do so. Well, the U.S. and Israel obviously couldn't support that paragraph because the phrase racist and colonialist regimes referred to the apartheid regime of South Africa, which they were supporting, and the foreign military occupation referred to the occupied territories, where you're not allowed to resist occupation because the U.S. supports it. Well, that's the major resolution on terrorism. We're during a decade where terrorism was the lead issue, top issue of the day, war on terror, plague of the modern age, return to barbarism, etc. But we can't talk about this any more than we can talk about any of the other things I mentioned, because it's the wrong story for the United States, not for the rest of the world. What about Latin America, which was supposed to be where the triumph of Reagan's yearning for democracy was taking place? Well, it was kind of the poll that I mentioned in Iraq, where 1% agreed with U.S. columnists and commentators that the U.S. entered Iraq to preserve democracy. That poll also had a more interesting answer, which shows some sophistication. In one of the questions in the poll, about half the population said the United States would support democracy in Iraq, but would control it. Okay. Well, that's sophisticated. That shows an understanding of history. It's not hard for Iraqis to have that understanding. They've had a century of experience with it. Since Iraq was created by the British, it was to be free and independent and had its own parliament and everything else, except that, as the British internal secret records described it, and Iraqis knew without bothering to read secret records, Iraq, like other countries in the region, was to be run by what the British called an Arab facade, which would carry out local administration and management, while the British effectively ruled from behind the scenes, behind one or another constitutional fiction, as they put it, like, say, democracy. And the locals would be allowed to, tow cars that are illegally parked, for example, and other such activities. But if they ever got out of line, British muscle would be there to make sure they get back into line. And that's the kind of democracy the Iraqis, for some odd reason, expect the United States to institute, partly because of their own history, but partly because they may, for example, know something about the history of Latin America, including during the Reagan era of yearning for democracy. Americans are uniquely unaware of what happened there. It's known in most of the world, not here. Actually, it is known here a little bit. So, for example, there's some important scholarly work on the Reagan yearning for democracy. The most important work on it, in fact, is done by a Latin American scholar, Thomas Carruthers, who wrote the main books and articles, who's interesting particularly because he's also an insider. He was working inside the Reagan State Department in their what they call democracy enhancement programs. So he's writing both as an insider and as a scholar describing what happened. He says the policies were very sincere, as I'm sure they were, just as sincere as Stalin's policies of bringing democracy to Eastern Europe. Actually, we have good evidence that those were sincere because the released Russian archives that are coming out, which are mostly pretty boring, do have some interesting things, like the discovery that internally they talked the same way they did externally. So it meant they're probably sincere when they talked about the need to preserve democracy in Eastern Europe, to protect it against fascism and so on and so forth. Yeah, probably very sincere. And Carruthers is probably right to say that the yearning for democracy was sincere in the Reagan State Department. But he says it was a failure. And he also is honest enough to point out that it was a systematic failure in a very striking way. in the southern cone of Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, in the southern cone where the United States had least influence, there was progress toward democracy, which the Reagan administration opposed every step of the way, but finally had to accept because it was just taking place anyway. On the other hand, in the region nearer the United States, where the U.S. had more control, in fact, almost total control, he said the progress was least. In fact, virtually none, because the U.S., as he puts it, would only tolerate top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites who were linked to the United States would remain in power. In other words, you could have pretty much what the Iraqis expect. Formal democracy, that's good for public relations purposes, as long as you're guaranteed that they do what you tell them. And that's just what's happened in Iraq. Again, it doesn't take a genius to recognize that democracy is going to be given to Iraq under certain conditions. The occupying authorities have already imposed an economic plan which no sovereign country would ever accept. It opens up the country to complete takeover by foreign corporations, mainly U.S. corporations and banks. Some Iraqis will benefit, namely the local collaborators with the foreign owners. That's the way the imperial system has always worked. Plenty of people benefit in the poorest country you like in the world, Southern Africa, anywhere else. There's a rich sector which lives at an incredible level of luxury. Yeah, that's the traditional elites linked to foreign power. And yes, that'll happen in Iraq, but no independent development. It's all under foreign, mainly U.S. control. The economic plan that was imposed illegally, incidentally, it's in strict violation of the Geneva Conventions on Occupying Powers. That doesn't bother anyone either. That plan so far has left out the oil industry because that would just be too blatant. So it'll happen indirectly and slowly in other ways. They also announced at once, as soon as the democracy lecture was given, that the government of Iraq, the democratic government, would agree, and wouldn't have any choice about it, to what amounts to a status of forces agreement of the usual sort, guaranteeing the right of American military forces to stay there as long as they like, and to establish military bases there, permanent military bases, right at the heart of the oil-producing region. That's extremely significant. Carruthers' account of democracy in Latin America is accurate. The Iraqis understand it even without reading internal records of the British or academic studies in the United States, because it's their own history. And most of the people in the world understand it from just their own lives. It's only here where we're not allowed to understand it, much too dangerous. I should say that despite all this, there have been improvements. The changes in American society over the past 40 years, which are significant, reflect themselves in the way these matters are dealt with. So, for example, no American president today could possibly carry out the kinds of terrorist atrocities in, say, Cuba that Kennedy could carry out without anyone batting an eyelash. The country is just too civilized. And there's interesting examples, very striking examples, which ought to be on the front pages of the newspapers, but you can figure out even though they're not there. So take Brazil, the most important country in Latin America. They just carried out an achievement which is quite astonishing, and from which we ought to try to learn something if we're actually interested in democracy. They carried out an achievement in democracy which is unimaginable in the United States. The popular movements developed over the past 20 years under very harsh conditions. It's a brutal and repressive state, and they overcame not only harsh repression, but tremendous concentration of capital and of media, much beyond what we have, and elected their own president, who happens to be a very impressive figure. Nobody remotely like him in the U.S. political system or the West anywhere. And they did it. That's a democratic achievement, which we can't imagine. In the United States, most of the population is well aware that elections are bought. You don't have people who represent the public. But in Brazil, they can do it. Well, again, that's something, for one thing, that would make us feel humiliated, but also from which we could learn if anybody cared about democracy. It's 40 years ago, under Kennedy, Brazil also had a populist president, nowhere near Lula, nothing like it, and with nowhere near as much popular support, but he was kind of a mildly populist president. Well, at that point, the Kennedy administration organized a military coup, which took place immediately after the assassination, but had already been placed in motion by John F. and Robert Kennedy, which instituted what's called a national security state, neo-Nazi state, torture, repression, violence. Brazil's an important country, so it had a domino effect throughout the continent. One of the effects was the other 9/11, which was one of the other military coups that followed in this. And they got rid of him. That threat was overcome. Today, there's no military coup planned in Brazil, though the threat to U.S. corporate and power interests is much greater. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons, and they're worth thinking about. One reason is that the population of the United States wouldn't tolerate it any longer, nor would the Brazilians, but we're talking about ourselves, which is what matters to us. People here would not tolerate a Kennedy-style military coup establishing a neo-Nazi state. It's just become too civilized, thanks to the activism of mostly young people in the 60s and the following years. It's one reason why the 60s are so bitterly condemned and denounced in the liberal press. So, for example, last Sunday's New York Times book review, but constantly. They're hated because they civilized the country. They got people involved in women's rights and environmental issues, opposition to aggression and violence. I mean, all kind of horrible things happened then. No wonder it's denounced. But it did change the country a lot, and people would not accept a Kennedy-style terrorist war or a Kennedy-style military coup. Those are not possible now, fortunately. That's progress. But there's another reason why there's no plan for a military coup. It's not needed. The actions of the Clinton administration and its predecessors in establishing international economic arrangements under the fraudulent cover of free trade has almost nothing to do with trade, but the international economic arrangements that are called neoliberal everywhere else in the world, here they're called free trade, it's a joke, and that you see in the World Trade Organization that were just brought up to be extended in the Miami atrocities that took place a couple of weeks ago. Those arrangements are very effective. They began around 30 years ago with the breakdown of the post-war international economic system, first by liberalization of capital flow and deregulation of currencies. Now, it was well understood that control over capital flows is critical to democracy. Keynes pointed out 70 years ago that unless there are controls over capital, as he put it, the experiment with democracy in the West is seriously in danger. And the reasons are obvious. When you have free flow of capital, free speculation, that creates what international economists call a virtual senate of investors and lenders who carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policy. And if the government is doing something they don't like for example, improving health care instead of improving conditions for investment, they simply destroy the economy and by attacking the currency, by capital flight, and other means. So they have a stranglehold over countries, which is a terrific way of preventing democracy. In fact, those rules on capital controls and regulated currencies were instituted after the Second World War in order to permit what we call welfare states. Social democratic policies give some range for governments to carry out policies which had enormous popular support after the war. It's taken a long time to break that down. It's slowly being broken down by corporate capital concentration, but it's taken time. One of the methods is to free up capital flow, break down financial controls, but there are others. Every element of the neoliberal package of what they're selling in Miami is intended to undermine democracy very explicitly. So take, say, privatization. Is there any economic reason for privatization? Not that anybody's ever shown. But there is a very good political reason for privatization. It's true, and it's almost obvious by definition. If you privatize something, it's out of public control. It's out of the public arena. Okay? It's under the control of totalitarian institutions, unaccountable totalitarian institutions. That's what corporations are. Unaccountable totalitarian institutions with enormous power. Put something into their hands, it's out of the public arena. So that reduces the threat of democracy by definition. When it extends to what's called trade and services, mentioned before, things like water, then you're finished. Services means anything that any human being could be interested in, like water, for example, or health, or education, or roads, or name it. Anything that we care about is services. Trade and services is a euphemism. It means privatization of services. It means handing them over to totalitarian institutions that are unaccountable to the public. That's what trade and services means. As you push through trade and services, you narrow the public arena. You continue with this, you can end up with formal democracies. And in fact, you don't even need terror anymore, or even control of opinion. You need nothing, because there's no public arena left. There's nothing for people to make decisions about. It's all in the hands of tyrannical institutions which are effectively unaccountable to the public. Well, that's called neoliberalism. It's also harmful to the economy, but that's secondary. Those are the methods. That's what's being discussed. That's what's at issue in places like Miami and Cancun and so on. Well, at this point, we're up to the major methods of controlling and undermining democracy, which have to do with the main mission of the organization that's running this event, corporate control. Obviously, the most powerful institutions in the modern world. Plenty to say about them. Now we're at the heart of the problem, but now I'll stop. It's not about the title that was announced.
All right, well, thank you for seeing us today. And as you know, we want to talk really about ideas of anarchism and your thoughts on anarchism. And it's going to be a rather wandery chat,
okay,
but hopefully we'll get somewhere.
Yeah, see, never know.
All right. I think in the middle 90s, you, in an interview that you gave, you talked about one of the problems with anarchism was that maybe it was too negative. It criticised but didn't offer a positive.
Well, I don't. If I said that, I shouldn't have, because I don't agree with it.
Right.
In fact, you can take a look at the shelf up there.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
I mean, there are anarchist studies which offer proposals for society in such meticulous detail that they go beyond anything plausible, in my view. Like Abad de Santillán is a famous case. Who, in 1936, I guess, wrote a critique of the anarchist revolution in Spain, and he was an Argentine anarchist who was in Spain, and he, it's called After the Revolution or something like that, and he laid out a very detailed program for what a largely anarcho-syndicalist vision of Spanish society, or for that matter any society, ought to be like. And there are many other proposals. I mean, I think the question about detailed planning for the future is not so much can we do it? Sure, we can do it in lots of different ways, but whether we know enough about human beings, about society, about institutions, the effects of introducing institutional structures into human life. Do we know enough about that to be able to plan in any detail what a society should look like, or should it be an experimental, guided by certain general ideas about liberty and equality and authority and domination, and just let people explore different ways of working through this maze and see what comes natural to them, how much variety there should be. What are you going to do with people who don't want to work, or people with criminal tendencies, or people who don't want to go to meetings, and there's millions of questions that come up. To what extent do you want to interchange jobs or delegate responsibility on the basis of interest and talent and so on? I mean, if somebody wants to be a carpenter or a nuclear physicist or a pianist, and somebody else wants to be an administrator, do you necessarily require that they interchange jobs as a matter of principle, even if they're all happy or if they don't? I don't think we know. There's both positive and negative comments you can make about that, but I don't think we know the answers.
I was reading Isaac Puente, the Spanish libertarian communist theorist, who was arguing rather like that, and he was arguing that, if one becomes a teacher, one learns by experience, and if one becomes a doctor, one learns by experience. One isn't a doctor when one's 22. You learn, and maybe that's how anarchism ought to be seen.
Well, at a very general level, I think we would all agree that people in the rough range of those who call themselves anarchists, which is pretty broad, there would be at least a general agreement that whatever social structures and arrangements are developed, they ought to maximize the possibilities for people to pursue their own creative potential. And you can't make a formula for that.
No.
People are too different, and they ought to be different, and the differences ought to be encouraged. And just like with raising children, you want them to find their own path. You don't say, here's the rigid framework. Sometimes people do, but shouldn't say, here's the framework you're supposed to follow. And my own view, I differ from some of my close friends on this, is that we should be cautious about trying to sketch out the nature of a future society in too much detail. It's not that it can't be done. It can be done. It can be done in interesting ways, different ways, and has been done. But I think the real question is, to what extent is it important to do it, and to what extent is it important to just try and experiment and chip away at existing structures and so on. Actually, another problem, which I think must be faced, is that at any particular point in human history, people have not understood what is oppression. Mm-hmm. It's something you learn. Mm-hmm. If I go back to my, say, parents and say my grandmother, she didn't think she was oppressed by being in a super patriarchal family where the father would walk down the street and not recognize his daughter when she came, because you're not supposed to, not because you didn't know who she was, but because you don't nod to your daughter. Sure. That didn't feel like oppression. That just felt like the way life works. What psychic effects it had internally, that's a complicated question. But as anyone involved in any kind of activism knows, say the women's movement, one of the first tasks is to get people to understand that they're living under conditions of oppression and domination. Mm-hmm. It isn't obvious. No. And who knows what forms of oppression and domination we're just accepting without even noticing them. And at some further stage of self-enlightenment and communal understanding, we'll recognize those are things we have to deal with. And we can't plan for them if we don't know about them.
Linked to that, then, Emma Goldman, as she grew older and feared for the fact that there may not be an immediate revolution, became very influenced by, I think, Gustav Landauer, who talked about that the state isn't just out there, it's inside us. that we have to become ourselves as free as we can be in capitalism. That in fact she was always worried that there may be a chance that people won't be ready for revolution, and that there is a way of developing the politics of the personal, so maybe more people could be ready to experience that life that's possible.
That's quite true. I mean, people, in fact, there are, the people who understand this the best are those who are carrying out the control and domination. I mean, in the more free societies like the United States and England, where popular struggles have won a lot of freedom over the years, and the state has limited capacity to coerce, it is very striking that it's precisely in those societies that elite groups, the business world, state managers and so on, recognized early on that they're going to have to develop massive methods of control of attitude and opinion, because you can't control people by force anymore. And therefore you have to modify their consciousness so they don't perceive that they are living under conditions of alienation, oppression, subordination, and so on. In fact, that's what, probably a couple of $1 trillion a year spent on this in the United States, very self-consciously. I mean, from the framing of television advertisements for 2-year-olds to what you taught in graduate school economics programs. It's designed to create a kind of a consciousness of subordination, and it's also intended specifically and pretty consciously to suppress normal human emotions. So normal human emotions are sympathy and solidarity. I mean, not just for people. I mean, for stranded dolphins. It's just a normal reaction of people. And if you go back to, say, the classical political economists, people like Adam Smith, this was just taken for granted as the core of human nature. Any society's got to deal with this. Well, one of the main concentrations of advertising and education is to drive that out of your mind. And it's very conscious. In fact, it's conscious in social policy right in front of our eyes today. So they take the effort to destroy Social Security. Well, what's the point of that? Well, the point is, there's a lot of scam about financial problems and this and that, which is all total nonsense. And of course they want, they'd like Wall Street to make a killing, but underlying it all, I think, is something much deeper. Social Security is based on a human emotion, a natural human emotion, which has to be driven out of people's minds, namely the emotion that you care about other people. You care. It's a social response, a community responsibility to care whether a disabled widow across town has enough food to eat, or whether a kid across the street can, go to school or something. And you have to get that out of people's heads. You have to make them say, look, you're a personal, rational wealth maximizer. If that disabled widow didn't prepare for her own future, it's her problem, not your problem. It's not your fault that she doesn't have enough to eat, so why should you care?
There is no such thing as society, as Margaret Thatcher said.
Yeah, there's only you maximizing your own wealth and subordinating yourself to power and not thinking about anyone else. And that has an effect. You can see it in attitudes. Now, just get back to your point. Same is true of those who are trying to change society to more decent forms. Yes, you're going to have to deal with people's consciousness and awareness. And as I say, every organizer knows it. Take the women's movement as a striking example. It begins with consciousness-raising groups, where people talk to each other and bring out elements of their lives that they may not perceive very clearly. And it's true across the board, in educational institutions and factories, everywhere else. And it's very striking to see how this has worked over the years. If you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, say like right around here, Lowell and Lawrence, the places where the textile mills were being created and so on, among the people who were drawn into the early factories, young women from the farms, Irish artisans from the slums and so on, there was an extremely radical consciousness. It was just natural. They didn't read Marx or anything like this. Never heard of European radicalism. Never heard of anarchism or anything else. It's just the natural assumption. It's in their. They had a very free press. Something that's been lost, but the free press of those days expressed, just took for granted that wage labor is pretty much like slavery, and that those who work in the mills are on them. Obviously, why do we need these bosses telling us what to do? And that the whole factory system, industrial system, is just crushing our cultural values and creative impulses and turning us into robots and so on and so forth. All of this was understood, taken for granted. You go out to a working class neighborhood today, you won't find that. And that has to be, it's not that people have to be taught it, it has to be brought out from their inner nature, where it's been suppressed by very conscious efforts. Actually, it's striking to see how conscious this is. So, about like a century ago, Taylorism was introduced into industry. Taylorism, Frederick Taylor was.
Yes.
So the idea was the idea is to turn workers into robots. So every motion is controlled, and they don't have any choices, and they become essentially robots. It was like everything else. It was initiated in the military system, because there you can carry out experiments cost-free and public and cost and take risk-taking and so on. But then it was transferred to industry, it's the mass production system and so on. And it did. Lenin was very enamored of it. It was terrific, because he basically had the same conceptions as capitalist managers. And the idea was to robotize work. But it was very quickly recognized that, like the 1920s, that what they called on-job control, turning a person into a robot on the job, can be extended to off-job control. That is, controlling every other aspect of life the same way. So why should people not be robots in their entire life? And to be a robot means to focus your attention on what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, not on care for one another, not on working together to create a decent environment, not for what will the world be like for your children. Just turn you into a passive consumer, an obedient a person who pushes buttons every couple of years and is taught that's democracy, follows orders, don't think, and identify your own value as a human being in the amount of useless consumption that you can carry out. And that's off-job control. And it runs through all the institutions. And it's a huge industry.
Yes.
And yes, to overcome off-job control and make people realize that your value as a human being isn't how deep you can go in debt and how many credit cards you can max out to get commodities you don't want. That's not your value as a human being. It's something else. I mean, when you go to a mall and over the weekend and you see young kids who are in their spare time, young girls usually, their spare time, what's fun, is window shopping.
Yes.
I mean, that's, if they want to do it, you can't say don't do it. But what this tells you about how people's consciousness has been modified by off-job control is pretty frightening.
Yes, yes. Linked to that as well, one of the things that I think is striking when you look at the history of anarchism is that at its most popular, it was almost an organic movement and answering community needs. The Jewish anarchists in New York in the 1890s, in Spain obviously, but Argentina, as you mentioned, France. Isn't community also being destroyed by things such as technology, where now there are more communities in cyberspace than maybe the type of community that you or I may have grown up? Myself, I'm just a coal mining community where you knew everyone and everyone knew you, and yes, there were tensions, but you had that sense of relationships. Isn't that really going very quickly, and isn't technology helping that go?
Well, in my view, technology is a pretty neutral instrument.
Right.
It could go in that direction, it could go in opposite directions.
Right.
I mean, technology could, in fact, be used to let the workforce in a factory run it without any managers,
Sure.
by providing people at the workbench with real-time information that would enable them to join with others in making sensible decisions. That's another use of technology.
Sure,
of course,
absolutely.
that technology didn't get developed. And in fact, there are very interesting studies of how it does work. So one of the main studies was done by, some of the best was done by David Noble, who used to be here and a little too radical.
Yeah.
Doesn't here anymore.
Yeah.
But he did some terrific work on a lot of things. But one of the main topics he studied was what's called numerical processing. That is, computer-controlled machine tool production, that kind of thing. And that was, like everything else, developed in the military system, where you can do it at public cost.
Right.
But it was designed. There were a lot of different ways of designing it, he points out. So one way of designing it would have been to eliminate managerial levels and put decision-making into the hands of skilled mechanics, who sort of knew what they're doing. They're usually the people who know more anyway than the guys in the offices upstairs.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was true in the coal mine.
Yeah,
The guys in the coal mine work, the guys down there,
Yeah,
not the one who's sitting
yeah,
in an office
yeah.
in New York somewhere. But so put the decision-making into their hands, and the technology could have been designed for that. And studies were done showing that would even increase profits. But it was done the opposite way. It was done in such a way as to increase levels of management control, which is highly inefficient, to de-skill mechanics, and to turn them into robots who would just push the buttons.
Yes.
Well, that's a choice as to how to use technology. And it's a kind of class warfare.
Mhm.
But it has nothing to do with the inherent nature of technology. And I think the same is true here.
Right.
However, the point you make is an interesting one, and I don't know what's going to come of it. But it is true that there are virtual communities,
Yes.
which are very real. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say that 95% of my close friends I've never seen.
Yes.
We just interact all the time on the internet. And, my age, I figure it's perfectly reasonable. But when I see my grandchildren do it, I don't like it much. I mean, I think they have to learn
Yes.
things about face-to-face communication.
Well, just going, yes, because, I mean, my son does instant messaging, and he instant messages with people whom, when he's at school, he can hardly talk to.
Yeah.
But it provides a neutral framework. But I worry enormously because I'd rather he spoke and interacted.
I agree with you. I don't know what kind of effect this is going to have on young kids growing up.
Right.
I mean, they live in an imaginary world.
Yeah.
And even interacting with people who are adopting false personalities. When kids used to play Dungeons and Dragons, well, okay, I wasn't, I didn't love it, but I didn't see anything much wrong with it. On the other hand, when a lot of your life is in an imaginary world with characters who you have created themselves, and you don't have face-to-face human interactions with, that can have psychic effects, which I don't think we understand, but could be pretty malevolent.
Taking that a step forward, you know that there is a tendency, certainly in the last 10 years in anarchism, we call it primitivism, anarcho-primitivism, who suggests that capitalism is so rotten, the technology involved in capitalism is so rotten, that we just ought to just get rid of the whole thing. It's so destructive, so corroding, so horrible that it's just damaging people. Let's just get rid of it and step, back or forward, in their eyes, to a more natural, organic world at one with nature. Is that possible?
I mean, I sympathize with the people who say that, but I don't think they are realizing that what they're calling for is mass genocide of billions of people, because the way society is now structured and organized, urban life and so on and so forth, if you eliminate these structures, everybody dies. For example, I can't grow my own food. It's a nice idea, but it's not going to work. Not in this world. And in fact, none of us want to live a hunter-gatherer life. There are just too many things in life that the modern world offers us. But just in plain terms of survival, that's calling for the worst mass genocide in human history.
Yes.
And unless one thinks through these things,
Yes.
it's not really serious.
Yes. I agree. Sorry, a couple of quick things now. A lot of people I know in Europe know you through your introduction to Daniel Guérin's book, Anarchism. And it's like a while ago, AK Press put out his No Goes No Masters in English.
It's right up
Yeah,
there.
it's a great book. It's obvious that for Guérin, he was very keen to blend what I think he felt were the best aspects of anarchism and the best aspects of socialism into this libertarian, communist, libertarian socialism.
Libertarian socialism is what he called it.
Do you think that those two terms, libertarian socialism and anarchism, are synonymous, or do you think there are real differences?
Well, I don't think you can really say, because the terms of political discourse aren't well defined.
Sure.
I mean, capitalism, trade, state, pick any one, they're pretty loose terms, which is okay. It doesn't make sense to try to define terms carefully when you don't have any explanatory theory to embed them in. But the fact is that we can't really answer the question. Anarchism covers too many things. Libertarian socialism covers too many things. But I sympathize with what he's trying to do. I think it's the right thing. I think if you look carefully, there are really close similarities and relationships among the anti-state, the more anti-statist, anti-vanguardist left elements of the socialist movement, the Marxist movement, in fact. Say people like Anton Pannekoek and others. There's close similarities between them and some of the wings of the anarchist movement, like the anarcho-syndicalists. In fact, it's pretty hard to make much of a distinction between, say, Pannekoek's workers' councils and anarcho-syndicalist conceptions of how to organize society. There are some differences, but they're the kind of differences that ought to exist when people are working together in comradely relationships.
Sure.
That's a sensible blend,
sure,
in my view.
And
the much sharper distinction is between all of these movements and the various forms of totalitarianism, like Bolshevism or corporate capitalism and so on. Yes. There you have a real break. Totalitarian structures on the one hand, free societies on the other. In fact, I think there are similarities between, significant ones, between libertarian socialism and anarchism, this blend, and even very mainstream thinkers like John Dewey.
Yeah, yes.
There are striking similarities.
Well, I know he was quite influenced by Stelton, the modern school, and he took a lot of those ideas and thought about and visited.
His basic view was that unless we eliminate what he called industrial feudalism and turn it into industrial democracy, which means pretty much workers' control, then the whole formal democratic system doesn't really mean very much. And he comes straight out of the mainstream American histories of Americans, apple pie.
A couple of quick things. I know from reading you, you're very much impressed, I think, it would be good, by people like Pannekoek and Gorter, that left communist strand. I take it you don't see a danger of things like workers' councils or the work of Pannekoek or Gorter lead into another form of totalitarianism. You think that breaks from that?
No, I think there's plenty of danger.
Right.
But there's also danger that participatory economics could lead to totalitarianism. Every one of us has been in movement meetings, and we all know the dynamics. If you're whatever you're working on, putting a traffic light on the corner, or organizing resistance against the Vietnam War, whatever it may be, there's a meeting of people, and we differ in our levels of tolerance for boring activities. Some people just drop off pretty fast, like me, for example. I just can't tolerate too much of it. Other people are really committed to basically controlling it. And there is a natural dynamic in which the most free, cooperative, libertarian structure can turn into an authoritarian one, just by virtue of who's going to stick around and, take enough control and finally make the decisions, and everybody wants to go do something else, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Well, those are always dangerous.
The last person standing is the one.
And you'll never overcome them. We're all perfectly familiar with it from groups of friends, affinity groups working on something or other.
Yes.
So yes, those are always problems to deal with, and you can't. There's no magic formula for preventing that from happening.
Okay, and linked to that, I guess, is what you feel about the role of class in change in anarchism. There's no doubt that certainly I think in America there is a tendency in anarchism, in new anarchist thought, to see classes belonging to the past. It really isn't the most relevant foci, loci of change anymore.
How many of those people have worked in your coal mining community, let's say, or on a factory floor, or as data processors in industry? I mean, if those are your jobs, you don't have any problem with class.
Right.
You know who gives the bosses and who gives the orders and who takes them, and you know why. You understand the capital concentration that lies behind the choice of those who give the orders and those who take the orders. Now, those are class differences. Often some other domain you can say, I don't see them, but enter into the real life of people who live and work in society, and I don't think they have much problem discerning class differences and their significance. There's a huge difference between giving orders and taking.
Yeah. Yes.
And even if it's true that the people who are giving orders are taking them from somewhere else, but that's the nature of totalitarian systems. I mean, it's not the top guy gives the orders to the bottom guy. There's levels of transmission through which orders are taken and given, managerial supervision and decision-making of various kinds, and that creates a whole variety of fundamental class differences. And there are plenty of people who just take the orders, or else starve.
Yeah,
choice.
Sure.
And in fact, we see class issues arising all the time. I mean, take, say, real concrete issues. Like one of the very concrete issues right now is what's called outsourcing. Mm-hmm. What attitude should people take toward outsourcing? And there are conflicting values. I mean, first of all, outsourcing is a very misleading term. Outsourcing is internal to totalitarian institutions. I mean, if GM outsources, that means they are transferring jobs to a company, a firm under their control, which is able to escape labor laws, environmental constraints, and so on, and to give them cheap inputs for the next stage of manufacturing. But that's all internal to command economies. So outsourcing is, it's kind of like a pretense. It has something to do with the free market, or doesn't. It doesn't. It has to do with internal workings of command economies. All right, what should our attitude be towards it? I mean, if people here are losing their jobs because you can get a worker at 10% of the cost in, say, India or China, should we be for it or against it? Well, there's arguments both ways. And I think all the arguments are highly misleading because they're accepting a framework that we shouldn't accept. I mean, if you accept the framework that says totalitarian command economies have the right to make these decisions, and the wage levels and working conditions are fixed facts, and then we have to make choices within those assumptions. Well, then you can make an argument that poor people here ought to lose their jobs to even poorer people somewhere else, because that increases, economic pie, and you go through the usual story. But why take those assumptions?
Yeah.
I mean, there's other ways of dealing with the problem. For example, rich people here, like people like me, for example, who are on the top few percent of the income ladder, we could cut back our luxurious lifestyles, pay proper taxes, all sorts of things, and I'm not even talking about Bill Gates. I mean, just people who are reasonably privileged. Instead of imposing the burden on the poor here, and say, well, you poor people have to give up your jobs because even poorer people need them over there. We could say, okay, we rich people will give up some small part of our ludicrous luxury and use it to raise living standards and working conditions elsewhere, and to let them have enough capital to develop their own, economy by their own means, and then the issue won't arise. But it's much more convenient to say poor people here ought to pay the burden under the framework of command economy totalitarianism. That's the easy way. But if you think it through, it's certainly not the only way.
No, it's not. No.
And almost every social issue you think about, real one, live one, the ones right on the table,
Sure.
Has these properties.
Right.
We don't have to accept and shouldn't accept the framework of domination of thought and attitude that allows only certain choices to be made. And those choices almost invariably come down to how to put the burden on the poor.
Yes.
That's class warfare.
Yes.
You don't want to call it class, don't use the word, but it's class
Yes.
warfare,
Yes.
even by real nice people like
Sure.
us who think that it's good to help poor workers in
Yeah.
China.
Yeah.
But within a framework of class warfare, which preserves our own privilege and transfers the cost to the poor here. And these are
Critical.
again
Critical.
matters of raising consciousness among very decent people,
Yeah.
our friends.
Aye. I mean, here's a more grim question, I guess. Voltaire de Cleyre, in the 1900s, in an essay, talks about the hope she has of a peaceful change into a better world, and talks about then the masters who are creating such a system that they're going to reap a horrible whirlwind. Now, are we still in a situation where a peaceful transition to a freer, better world is possible for us? Or can we not say, or is it unlikely as the years go on?
Actually, nobody knows.
Right.
But my own subjective judgment, low credibility subjective judgment, is that the opportunities for peaceful change are considerably greater now than they have been in the past.
Right.
And the reason for that is that the repressive apparatus of state and corporate power has been reduced. You can't break up strikes with Pinkerton guards anymore. They won't get away with it. You can't send out the police to smash up working class self-run towns like Homestead, Pennsylvania, and the National Guard. You can't get away with that anymore. Well, all that makes a difference. I mean, enough victories have been won.
Yes.
So that repression has reduced. I mean, just take a look at this simple question of how many workers get killed in labor action.
Yeah.
Well, it used to be very high.
Oh, yes.
And it went up to the late 1930s.
Yes.
I can remember it as a kid, workers getting killed in labor actions by security guards, Pinkerton's police and the rest of it. That has stopped.
Yes.
Maybe occasionally it'll happen, but it's a substantial change.
Certainly, when we look at the Emma Goldman papers,
Yeah.
we look at the New York Times, or we get students to look at the daily papers of the 1890s. I think every week there's an unnamed worker just being killed.
I mean, I saw it as a kid.
Yeah.
And childhood memories of watching police wade into groups of women strikers outside a textile plant and just beating the shit out of them. Well, I don't think you get away with it now.
No.
All right, and that generalizes. Just like it'd be much harder now for the U.S. to institute a military coup in, say, Brazil than it was 40 years ago. Much harder. In fact, probably impossible, because there have been just enough changes so that people won't accept it anymore, and the structures of power have dissolved.
Right.
By now, in fact, a lot of the structures of power are very fragile. A lot of them have shifted from direct coercion to indoctrination and thought and attitude control. Well, that's bad enough. It's bad enough to have your kids bombarded with horrendous television, but it's a lot different than having them beaten over the head by police.
Yes.
And having torture chambers around and so on. So those changes mean that there are many more options for peaceful change.
But it does make it more complex to fight back.
Yeah, it makes it very complex because you have to fight out of...
At least if there's a Pinkerton guard, you know who your
You
enemy
know who your
is.
enemy is. And when it's your friendly executive in the soulful corporation who's really on the same side that you are, and so on and so forth, then it's harder. But it doesn't mean it's impossible.
No.
Just a couple of days ago, I happened to be giving I hope I'm not giving personal things away, but I happened to give a talk, which I do every year, to a terrific group of mostly young labor activists in a group at Harvard, which is run by a fantastic person, Elaine Bernard, who's a real dynamic, live wire, labor activist, feminist, terrific. This program for the bringing the young labor leaders into Harvard was begun, I guess, around 1940 as part of the corporate academic reaction to this perceived threat, real threat, of significant radical labor action that might just revolutionize the country. I mean, after all, a sit-down strike is like one thought away from taking over the plant. And it was really close, and it was understood. Well, part of the technique of undercutting that, as it was becoming harder to use Pinkerton guards and police and so on to smash this up, it became understood that what you have to do is socialize the rising young labor leadership, civilize them, teach them how to bring them to Harvard and do what Harvard's good at. In fact, what it does with its own students, teach them how to have polite conversations and class solidarity, and drink the right wine and just pick up the right attitudes into relations and so on. So let's stick these young guys in the business school, and they'll see we're all friends and we're all doing the same thing, and so on and so forth. And it went on like that for years until Elaine Bernard took it over about 10 years ago.
Subvert that.
Almost instantly, it's become a center for radical international labor activism.
Yeah.
And the reason is all these ideas are just barely below the surface. And just puncture the surface slightly, and it all comes out. Because it's all so natural and obvious. It takes massive effort to beat it down. And by now it's completely different. And has big effects all throughout the world because people come from everywhere. Well, that can be done in all kinds of places, but those are modes of peaceful change. And they've, just in our own lifetimes, they've led to very big changes. And in the past, even more. Something like, the changes go in both directions. So on the one hand, you can't crush Homestead the way you could 100 years ago. On the other hand, the consciousness that led to Homestead is gone. So it's not just progress, but rebuilding that consciousness is the kind of peaceful activity that can be carried out and is in many respects a lot easier than fighting the National Guard.
Yes. A final question, because I think we're running out of time. I've just been working on Berkman's book Now and Then, and just AK Press have just republished it, What is Anarchism? Reading his letters in the 20s when he's working on the book and he's finding it very difficult, one of the things that he's trying to come to grips with, I think, in the book is, well, why haven't people come to this idea? This idea, which to me is just common sense, is just what we were saying earlier, this natural instinct almost to solidarity and support. And I've seen Russia, I've seen totalitarianism in action. Why haven't anarchist ideas had a greater impact in the world? I think he's talking about. Now that's 80 years ago nearly, and the question we're also facing as people who at least believe, what is it, Emma Goldman says, anarchism is the only belief that shows men and women their true self, who they can be. We see that, we know that instinctively, yet it's still had such a minuscule impact. Is that true, or is it
I don't think it's true that it's had a minuscule impact. I mean, a lot of the progressive social change of the past century, isn't anarchist, like a
Right.
progressive taxation isn't anarchist, Social Security isn't anarchist, but it's a reflection of attitudes and understanding, which, if they go a little bit further, do reflect anarchist commitment. And they are based on the idea that there really should be solidarity, sympathy, community, mutual support, mutual aid, and so on and so forth, and opportunities for creative action. And they're all based on these. They don't, they're subdued and channeled and modified, so they don't take real libertarian forms. But they're there, and they lead to social change. Why hasn't it gone further? Well, a large part of it is violence. So take, say, Berkman's experience in Russia. He entered into a violent totalitarian state. I mean, up until the Bolshevik takeover, coup, revolution, whatever you want to call it, up until that, there were very significant popular libertarian, sometimes anarchist initiatives all over, running from peasant anarchism in the Ukraine to workers' councils, the Soviets, and so on and so forth. Well, they were simply smashed by force, by great violence. I mean, Lenin and Trotsky were totalitarian extremists, and they had a theory behind it. They were kind of dedicated Marxists who believed that a backward, primitive country like Russia can't go to socialism. The master's principles tell us that. And therefore we have to drive the country by force through the stages of essentially state capitalist development, and then ultimately something will happen. I mean, they weren't repeating the master accurately. This required suppression of many years of Marx's later work, which were literally suppressed when he was studying the peasant societies in Russia and so on and so forth. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, the point is they had a conception, they used it, they had the force. It wasn't easy, to destroy Makhno's movement or Kronstadt or to eliminate the Soviets and so on. It wasn't a trivial operation, but it was carried out. And Berkman saw it, and he saw a vicious totalitarian society arising very much the way anarchists had predicted.
Yes.
I mean, Bakunin spelled it all out.
Yes.
In fact, even Trotsky in his early
Yes.
work before he joined it said what was going to happen, as did Rosa Luxemburg and others. But it happened. And that's their variant. Our variant was different. Berkman was writing right after Wilson's Red Scare, which made the Patriot Act look like a Tea Party. It was a violent repression run by the progressives, Woodrow Wilson and others, and not just affecting anarchists, not just Emma Goldman, who was kicked out, but even people pretty much in the mainstream, like Eugene Debs, leading labor figure. Wilson was completely vindictive. Tossed him into jail because he raised some questions about the nobility of Wilson's war and refused even to grant him an amnesty when everyone else was granted an amnesty. This was real vindictive. And it really crushed independent thought, crushed labor, had a big effect. So it was violence. Alongside the violence, there is the rise of massive propaganda. That's the rise of the public relations industry to try to control attitudes and beliefs. But quite apart from that, there's something quite simple. I mean, there are disciplinary effects to the way life is organized. Take, say, students today. Students today are more, in some ways, in a lot of ways they're freer than they were 60 years ago, their attitudes and commitments and so on. On the other hand, they're more disciplined.
Yes.
They're disciplined by debt.
Yes.
Part of the reason for arranging education so you come out with a heavy debt is so you're disciplined. Or let's take the last 20 years, the neoliberal years roughly, what's called globalization, but neoliberalism. A lot of it is, a very striking part of it is just aimed at discipline. It wants to eliminate freedom of choice and impose discipline. How do you do it? Well, if you have a couple in the United States now working, each of them 50 hours a week to put food on the table, you don't have time to think about how to become a libertarian socialist.
Oh,
What you're worried about is how do I get food on the table tomorrow?
Where can I shop cheaply?
Yeah, I mean, I got kids to take care of, and I got something to do with them. You know, when they're sick, I've got to go to work, and what's going to happen to them? You know, and that's well-designed techniques of imposing discipline, and there are costs to trying to be independent. I mean, just take, say, trying to organize a labor union. I mean, if you're the organizer, there's going to be a cost to you. I mean, maybe the workforce will gain, but there's a cost to you. We know there is. We know what the cost is, not just in energy and effort, but just in punishment.
Yes.
And the people who are living in fragile circumstances they make a reasonable calculation. They say, why should I take the cost? I've got to get by. So there are many reasons why normal instincts and attitudes don't come out. But, you know, over time they often do. That's why we have social change for the better.
Okay. Hey, thank you for your time. It's really kind.
Okay.
It's really kind of you. Great to meet you as well. Thank you for your talk.